Hello there, and welcome to Planet in Question. This is the quiet corner where curiosity doesn't have to rush, where science is more like a soft evening walk than a hurried march, and where the questions we ask are allowed to linger, drifting gently like leaves on a stream. Tonight, I'd like to take you far back in time, farther back than dinosaurs, farther back even than forests, insects, or the first creatures that crawled from the sea. I'd like to invite you into an age of Earth before animals existed at all. It is a time that is so distant, so strange, that imagining it feels almost like trying to picture another planet. And in a way, it was another planet, though it is the same world beneath our feet. Before we wander too deeply into that vast silence, let's pause for something grounding. Where are you listening from right now? Are you curled up in a quiet room, maybe with the weight of blankets holding you steady as the day gives way to night? Or perhaps you're outside, headphones in, the soft sounds of the world around you mixing with this voice. Maybe it's morning where you are, and the day is just beginning. Or perhaps you've pressed play in the middle of the afternoon, looking for a little space to breathe. Wherever you are, whenever you are, you and I are sharing this moment together, and that feels fitting, because tonight's journey is about shared moments too. Moments in deep time, long before we were here, when the Earth was shaping itself into something new. If you find this kind of gentle exploration soothing, I'd be grateful if you tapped the like button, maybe even subscribed. It helps this small corner of calm find others who might also need a quiet pause in their day. But no pressure, no urgency, just an invitation to join me if it feels right. Now, let's ease our minds back not just hundreds of years, not even millions, but billions. Think of Earth's history as a single 24-hour day. The planet forms at midnight, a fiery molten sphere cooling under the weight of endless bombardments from space. The first simple microbes appear around 4 a.m., drifting in primeval oceans. Multicellular life doesn't arrive until evening. Dinosaurs don't step onto the stage until late at night. And humans? Our entire story fits only in the last few seconds before the next midnight. So, if we want to talk about Earth before animals, we're talking about almost the entire day. Nearly all of Earth's history was animal-free. Imagine standing on the land back then, though. Land may not look like what you picture. There were no trees, no grass, not even moss or ferns. The continents, if you could call them that, were bare rock, sharp ridges, and volcanic plains, coated here and there with thin films of microbial life. The colours would seem alien to us. Without plants to soften the view, the world might have appeared rust-red in some places, deep black in others, with patches of minerals gleaming under a sky that did not yet carry the blue we take for granted. The air itself was different. For much of that time, oxygen was scarce or non-existent. Instead, methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen made the atmosphere heavy and strange. Breathing it would not have been possible for us. And yet, it was in this alien air that the first great experiments of life began. The silence would be overwhelming. Picture a beach with no seabirds, no crabs scuttling in the sand, no insects humming. Only the hiss of waves, the roar of wind, the crackle of volcanic fire. If you leaned close to the shore, you might see the first living communities clinging to the rocks, thin, slimy mats of bacteria, building tiny layered structures that we now call stromatolites. These weren't animals. They weren't even plants. They were simpler, stranger, but in their quiet way, they were reshaping the planet. They were slowly releasing oxygen, a waste product for them, but the seed of possibility for everything that would follow. It's easy to forget just how patient the Earth has been. For billions of years, there were no animals, no forests, no buzzing, chirping, running life, just microbes, endless and small, working on a timescale so vast it's hard to comprehend. They painted the oceans in strange colours, sometimes purple with photosynthetic bacteria, sometimes green with algal blooms. They covered the rocks, they drifted in the seas, and they transformed the chemistry of the world. And here's the curious part. Even without animals, Earth was never empty. We sometimes imagine before animals as a kind of blank stage, waiting for the play to begin. But the truth is that life was already here, filling every niche it could find. It just didn't look like what we expect. No eyes to see, no ears to hear, no nervous systems to feel in the way we do. And yet, in their own tiny ways, these early creatures were already interacting, competing, evolving. They were shaping the sky above and the rocks beneath. When we think of history, we often picture human history, maybe extending back to the time of dinosaurs if we want to stretch our imagination. But Earth's deep history is so much longer, so much stranger. Whole worlds rose and fell before animals existed. Continents shifted, collided, and split apart. Oceans opened and closed. Climates froze the Earth into an ice-covered sphere, then thawed it again. Volcanoes erupted for millions of years at a stretch, reshaping continents, filling skies with ash. Through it all, microbial life persisted, sometimes thriving, sometimes nearly vanishing, but always finding a way to continue. And so tonight, as we prepare to walk into that age of silence, I'd like you to hold one thought close. Animals, including us, are only the latest chapter. For most of Earth's story, the world was alive without them, alive in ways that are harder for us to picture but no less real. The air we breathe, the blue skies we admire, even the rust-red rocks we see in ancient outcrops, all of these are gifts from those early lives. Without them, animals could never have arrived. Without them, we would not be here at all. So let's step gently into that world together. Let's imagine the colours of its skies, the silence of its shores, the patience of its microbes. It is a strange and beautiful journey, one that asks us to slow down and let go of what we think of as normal. Because before animals, Earth was already extraordinary, and in its silence, it was preparing for everything that would come after. 1. A silent beginning. When we think of beginnings, we often picture noise explosions, the clash of elements, fire and fury, and in some sense, Earth's early days were filled with those things. But if we want to imagine the time before animals existed, we must move forward from that initial chaos into a quieter place, into a chapter of the planet's story where silence reigned in a way that is hard for us to truly grasp. Picture the Earth not as the familiar green and blue marble we see from space today, but as a landscape stripped of familiar sounds. There were no flocks of birds stirring the dawn, no crickets thrumming in the night, no rustle of mammals or reptiles moving through underbrush. There wasn't even underbrush. This was a world without animals, and that meant silence, an immense, stretching silence, broken only by the voice of the planet itself. Stand for a moment in your imagination on one of those first coastlines. There is no sand softened by countless shells and coral fragments, for such things had not yet come into being. Instead, jagged rock lines the water, dark and raw, sharp with volcanic birth. Waves crash against these shores, but the sound they make is lonely, echoing without life to answer it. The wind sweeps across plains of stone, carrying with it the smell of minerals and gas. The air is heavy, thick with elements that would choke us if we tried to breathe them. Carbon dioxide, nitrogen, methane, perhaps the faintest trace of oxygen, but not enough to sustain anything like us. Lightning forks across the sky more often than it does now, storms rolling endlessly across oceans that stretch outward without a single bird to dive into their waves. This silence is not emptiness, though it feels vast. Beneath the surface of the seas, life stirs, but it is microscopic, invisible to any eye that might be watching. Thin films of microbes cling to shallow rocks, catching sunlight and weaving energy from it. Others float freely in the water, drifting with currents that pay them no mind. If you could scoop up a handful of this seawater and look at it under a powerful microscope, you would see entire worlds, colonies of cells, dividing, feeding, drifting. But to the human senses, even if we had been there, the ocean would have looked utterly barren. There is something almost sacred about imagining this. A world alive but not yet noisy with movement. Life as a whisper instead of a song. The earth was waiting, though not in the conscious way we imagine waiting. It was a stage slowly being set, a canvas being prepared layer by layer, even if no audience yet existed to admire it. The rocks that rose from the oceans had no forest to anchor them. The mountains did not echo with animal cries. Instead, they stood stark against skies that looked different than our own. Depending on the time, the atmosphere might have glowed in strange hues, sometimes reddish from methane haze, sometimes darker, sometimes clearer. Without oxygen, the sky may not have carried the same blue that now feels so ordinary to us. Think of the sound of your own breath right now, the steady rhythm of air moving in and out of your lungs. That breath is only possible because Earth eventually became rich with oxygen, a gas created by tiny, unseen organisms that lived billions of years before you. But here, in this silent beginning, there was no such gift yet. To stand here would be to suffocate. Yet life thrived, quietly, on its own terms, content in forms that required no lungs, no nervous systems, no eyes. In this stillness, time moves differently. Our human sense of time is built around change, sunrises, migrations, growth and decay, the cycles of animals and plants. But in the silent earth before animals, change unfolded in spans so long we can barely grasp them. Entire millions of years might pass with little obvious difference, the same microbes slowly spreading, the same volcanic ridges rising and eroding, the same tides flowing without pause. A single day then was no different from another, yet each one carried forward the long experiment of life, moving patiently toward complexity. Now let yourself imagine walking across the land. There are no grasses under your feet, no flowers nodding in the breeze. Instead, you tread over raw stone, baked by the sun, fractured by the cold of night, and perhaps thinly veiled in biofilms of microbial life so small you would not notice them. Pools of shallow water may shimmer in depressions, coloured green, purple, or red by colonies of bacteria feeding on sunlight or minerals. To us, they would look alien, as though someone had spilled pigments across the landscape. But this was Earth's palette in those early days, vibrant not with flowers or leaves, but with the hidden chemistry of simple life. Silence does not mean inactivity. Beneath your feet, tectonic plates creep, mountains rise inch by inch, and molten rock shifts in chambers deep below. Volcanoes occasionally tear open the crust, spewing fountains of lava, their roar filling the air before quieting again. But once those eruptions subside, there is nothing to continue the song. No frogs call to one another in the cooling night. No wolves howl into the distance. Just the quiet hiss of steam, the crackle of cooling stone, and the wind pressing across the barren plains. What's strange to consider is that in this silence, Earth was already being prepared for animals. Every rock weathered by rain, every mineral shifted into the sea, every layer of atmosphere altered by microbial breath was laying down conditions that would one day allow complex bodies to thrive. In the stillness, in the absence of voices and footsteps, the groundwork for sound was being built. The silence was not permanent, it was only the pause before the music began. To us, accustomed to a world filled with noise, birds, insects, the hum of machines, the thought of such quiet might feel unsettling. But there is also a peace to it, isn't there? A sense of vastness that doesn't need to be filled. The earth was alive in its own way, but not yet crowded. It was a place of waiting, a place of becoming, and in its silence, it carried the slow heartbeat of a planet that had time to spare. If you close your eyes, you might even hear it now. Not in literal sound, but in imagination. The waves against stone, the hiss of volcanic gases, the endless sigh of wind across a treeless world. That was the song of the silent earth, a song without animals, but not without meaning. A song that lasted for billions of years before the next verse began. 2. The first oceans. If the silent beginning was marked by bare stone and alien skies, the next chapter in Earth's story was written in water. The oceans we know today, stretching wide and deep, home to whales and currents and coral reefs, were already ancient, long before the first animals appeared. But the oceans of that time were not quite the oceans we imagine now. They were younger, rawer, more chaotic in their chemistry, and far stranger in their colours. They were places of transformation, and in their depths, life took root. Imagine for a moment standing at the edge of one of those first seas. The shoreline is jagged, rough, still shaped by volcanic eruptions that send rivers of black lava to meet the waves. There is no sand, no shells crushed into fine grains, for there were no creatures yet to build them. Instead, the coast is sharp and hard, shimmering where hot stone meets water, releasing clouds of steam into the heavy air. The waves themselves do not sparkle blue as we expect. Depending on the mixture of gases, they may appear tinted green, brown, even reddish with dissolved minerals. In the shallows, microbial mats form slimy carpets, their surfaces glistening with colours unseen on modern shores. To human eyes, it would feel otherworldly, and yet this was home, the cradle where all of life would begin. Water was essential in more ways than one. It cooled the earth, calming the violence of constant bombardment from space. It dissolved minerals from the land, carrying them into solution, creating a soup rich with chemical possibility. It provided shelter from the harsh radiation of a young sun, protecting fragile life that would never have survived on exposed rock. Within its depths, the first cells found not just protection but abundance. Imagine tiny vesicles of molecules bumping into one another, fusing, dividing, carried by currents through this restless broth. Life began in fits and starts, in experiments that failed as often as they succeeded. But in the patience of time, some survived, some grew, some learned to capture energy from the environment around them. The first oceans were not static. They churned and shifted with tides pulled by a moon that was closer to Earth than it is now. Imagine tides rising hundreds of feet, racing across coasts, then retreating with immense force. These tides acted like mixers, stirring together nutrients and spreading life outward from the shallows. Lightning storms flashed above the waves, striking the surface and perhaps sparking chemical reactions that built the molecules of life. Volcanoes beneath the sea erupted in silence, pouring minerals and heat into the water, creating pockets where strange chemistries thrived. Hydrothermal vents belched hot, mineral-rich fluids into the deep, forming black chimneys that rose like towers in the darkness. Around them, even in this age without animals, microbes gathered, feeding on the chemical energy. These places may have been the earliest cities of life, bustling invisible communities in the dark. To float in these seas would not have been like swimming in ours. The water was thicker with particles, rich with dissolved iron and sulfur. In some places, it might have been tinted a rusty red from oxidized iron. In others, dark with volcanic ash. Without animals to stir the currents, the oceans moved to the rhythm of geology alone. Tides, storms, eruptions. Silence ruled here too, though if you could listen closely, perhaps you would hear the faint crackle of chemical reactions, the bubbling of gases, the rush of superheated water rising from vents. It was not lifeless, but it was a life we could not see or touch. What's remarkable is that these oceans endured. For billions of years, while the surface of the land was scraped and remade, while continents collided and broke apart, the oceans remained, carrying within them the story of life's earliest struggles. Each drop of seawater today carries echoes of that time. Salts dissolved from stone, oxygen from ancient microbes, minerals from vents that still belch in the deep. When you stand at a beach now and listen to the endless rhythm of the tide, you are hearing a sound that has never stopped, a voice that has been singing since before the first animals opened their eyes. Think about how empty they must have seemed to us, and yet how full they were in reality. The oceans were alive with microbes, though invisible to any human gaze. They floated freely, forming mats, clustering in colonies, shaping chemistry on a planetary scale. Without them, oxygen would never have filled the atmosphere. Without them, the seas would never have grown stable enough to support the complexity that followed. It is humbling to imagine that our entire lineage, everything from jellyfish to birds to people, is rooted in these tiny cells drifting in ancient water. We are their descendants, walking extensions of that first microbial ocean life. And the oceans gave more than life. They sculpted the climate. They absorbed the sun's heat, distributing it across the globe. They buffered the extremes of temperature, allowing stability to grow from chaos. Without them, Earth might have swung wildly from boiling to freezing. With them, a rhythm developed, one slow enough for life to adapt, to persist, to expand. The oceans were not just a home, they were a caretaker, holding the planet in balance long before animals arrived to complicate the picture. Let yourself imagine drifting on those waters. The surface reflects a sky strange and unfamiliar, sometimes hazy with methane, sometimes dim with storms. No birds trace their shadows across the waves. No fish leap, no dolphins arc. The horizon is empty, and yet beneath that surface, invisible legions are at work. They do not know what they are preparing. They do not know that one day animals will fill the seas, that coral reefs will blaze with colour, that whales will sing. They are only doing what life does, persisting, dividing, shaping. But their persistence is the reason any of the rest of us exist. It is strange, isn't it, to think that the oceans of that time, quiet as they were already carrying the promise of everything to come. Every ripple, every tide, every storm was part of the slow unfolding of possibility. The oceans were not empty, they were pregnant with the future. They were the stage before the curtain rose, the tuning of instruments before the symphony began. And though no animals swam in their depths, they were never silent, not really. The song of the oceans was already playing, a low, steady rhythm that would one day carry voices far more complex. So when you think of oceans today, when you hear the crash of waves or the hush of tides pulling away from shore, remember this: that sound is older than animals, older even than forests or flowers. It is the oldest voice of the planet, a voice that carried life through its most fragile beginnings, a voice that has never fallen silent. And as you listen, you are hearing not just water but history, billions of years deep. 3. A world without green. When we look around our world today, green is everywhere. It fills our forests and fields, stretches across hillsides, and drapes itself over gardens and city parks alike. The colour green has become so woven into our sense of Earth that it almost feels inseparable from the idea of life itself. Yet for most of Earth's history, especially in the time before animals, green was almost entirely absent from the land. Imagine a world stripped of grass, stripped of moss, stripped of trees and ferns and all the vegetation that now carpets our planet. What you would see instead is a world raw and bare, its surfaces exposed, painted not by leaves but by stone, dust and minerals. This was the Earth of long ago, a world without green. Picture yourself standing on a hillside in that age. There are no meadows, no forest canopies swaying in the breeze. Beneath your feet, there is only rock, fractured and broken by the long work of erosion but still unsoftened by roots or soil. Soil itself, as we understand it, did not yet exist. True soil is alive, formed by the mixing of rock fragments with decaying plant matter, stirred and aerated by the work of creatures beneath the surface. Without plants and without animals, the land was barren. The wind whipped across unbroken plains of stone, carrying only dust, not pollen, not seeds. It was a landscape more like the surface of Mars than the living Earth we know today. The colours would surprise you. Instead of greens, you might see vast stretches of rusty red, where iron in the rocks had oxidized, turning the land into something that looked scorched. You might see black volcanic plains, still fresh from eruptions, gleaming in the sunlight like spilled ink. In some places, strange films of microbes clung to wet stone, tinting it purple or brown, forming slick mats along the edges of streams and pools. These were the only splashes of life's colour visible on land, and they were small, fragile, sometimes almost invisible, but they were there, painting their own quiet strokes on a barren canvas. The absence of plants meant more than just a lack of greenery. It meant that the land was silent in ways difficult for us to imagine. Today, plants are not quiet things. They rustle in the wind, they creak as they grow, they drop leaves that crunch underfoot, they buzz with insects feeding on their blossoms. But in this world without green, the breeze passed unbroken across the stone. The air carried no scent of flowers, no pollen drifting through sunlight. Rain fell on bare ground, pooling briefly before rushing away, because without roots to hold it, the water could not linger. Rivers cut into the rock sharply, their banks unstable, constantly shifting with floods. The very rhythm of the land was different, harsher, more abrupt. And yet, despite its starkness, this world without green had its own strange beauty. Imagine mountains rising without tree lines, their slopes bare and gleaming under a pale Sunday. Imagine deserts of pure mineral sand, stretching endlessly without a single blade of grass. Imagine cliffs and valleys carved entirely from stone, their surfaces shining with mineral deposits unhidden by moss or lichen. To us, it might feel empty, but in its own way, it was alive with geology, with the slow and patient artistry of Earth itself. The sky above these barren lands carried a different weight as well. Without the regulation of oxygen-producing forests, the air was heavy with other gases, sometimes creating strange hues at sunrise and sunset. There were no fields of golden crops catching the light, no forest to cast long shadows. The horizon would have looked raw and open, a sweep of rock meeting sky with nothing to soften the view. It might have felt lonely, but perhaps also vast in a way we rarely experience now, when nearly every horizon we see is softened by green. If you wandered through this land, Your senses would search for signs of life and find very few. No birds would startle from the brush, because there was no brush. No insects would lift into the air, because there were no flowers to draw them. You might walk for days and see nothing but stone and water. And yet, if you paused by a stream or a tidal flat, you might notice the faint shimmer of microbial mats, their colours odd and muted, their presence subtle but persistent. They were the quiet heralds of what was to come, the first test of life's ability to live beyond the sea. What is striking is how much the absence of green would have changed not just the look, but the feel of the planet. Green is calming to us, associated with life and abundance. Without it, the land would have seemed stark, perhaps even hostile. And yet, in that starkness, there was possibility. Every drop of rain, every grain of mineral dust, carried the ingredients of soil to be. The green world we know today was hidden in potential, waiting for the right conditions, waiting for life to take its next leap forward. It's tempting to think of this barren land as unfinished, as though it were lacking something crucial. But perhaps it was not lacking at all, only different. It was a chapter in Earth's story where the land itself was the main character. Mountains rose and eroded without the help of roots to hold them. Rivers carved canyons quickly, carrying rock and sediment to the seas. Winds sculpted dunes of pure sand, unhindered by vegetation. It was a world sculpted entirely by stone, water, and air, a kind of raw art before the brushstrokes of green arrived. And so, this world without green was not a waiting room for life, but a canvas upon which the earliest experiments of land life would one day be painted. The microbes clinging to damp stone were the first hints of that, tiny beginnings that would eventually give rise to moss, then ferns, then trees. But at this stage, those futures were invisible. The land remained quiet, austere, open. To stand in that silence, to gaze across those bare horizons, would have been to glimpse Earth at its most elemental. No forests, no grass, no leaves. Just stone and sky, shaped by forces as old as the planet itself. And though we might long for the green that comforts us today, there is a kind of peace in imagining that starkness. A world honest in its simplicity, alive in its geology, carrying within it the seeds of the life that had not yet come. The Earth was not yet the lush garden we know, but it was already a stage worth marvelling, at a stage without green, but not without promise. 4. The breathless sky. When we lift our eyes to the sky today, we often take for granted what we see and what we breathe. The familiar blue above us feels eternal. The soft white of clouds drifting across it feels timeless. And the very air itself, rich with oxygen, feels like the most natural thing in the world. But in the ages before animals existed, the sky was not blue in the way we know it, and the air was not breathable. The atmosphere of early Earth was heavy and alien, more of a poison to creatures like us than a comfort. It was a sky without birds, without the beating of wings, without the scent of flowers carried on breezes. It was a breathless sky, both in the sense that there was no oxygen to inhale, and in the sense that its appearance would have left us stunned, unable to recognize it as the same sky we now call home. Imagine looking up on such a day. The colour above would not have been a steady blue dome, but perhaps a murkier hue tinged with red or orange, depending on the balance of gases floating in the air. Thick with carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and methane, the sky sometimes would have glowed with a hazy veil, especially when sunlight scattered through molecules unfamiliar to us. Volcanic eruptions added their own character, pouring ash and sulphur into the upper air, painting sunsets in strange purples or deep scarlets. Lightning would have laced across this turbulent atmosphere more often than now, a restless energy flashing through the haze, illuminating clouds swollen with rain. To us, it would have looked apocalyptic, yet for the early Earth it was simply the norm. And then there is the matter of breathing. If we were to somehow stand there, lungs unprepared for the chemistry of that atmosphere, we would suffocate almost instantly. Oxygen, the very gas that sustains every animal, was not yet present in amounts that mattered. In fact, when oxygen first began to appear in small quantities, it was a catastrophe for much of the life that had thrived in its absence. Early microbes that lived in oxygen-free environments found the new gas toxic. What would one day become the breath of animals was, in those days, a poison. The air, then, was not only alien, but dangerous. To imagine walking through such a world is to imagine a silence more profound than we can easily comprehend. Without animals, there was no chorus of sound, but without oxygen there was also no fire. Flames as we know them could not have burned, at least not in open air. Lightning struck, but the sparks it created would fizzle quickly, unable to catch in the oxygen-poor atmosphere. The crackle of forest fires, the smoke rising above landscapes, all of those things were impossible. Fire as a natural force did not yet exist on Earth, because the sky did not yet allow it. It is strange to think that something as fundamental as fire required animals' invisible ally oxygen before it could take hold. The breathless sky shaped everything. It influenced the chemistry of oceans, the minerals that formed in rocks, even the colours of ancient landscapes. Iron dissolved freely in the seas without oxygen to bind it, creating waters tinted green or rusty red. Only when oxygen finally began to rise in concentration did iron precipitate out, falling to the seafloor and forming vast bands of ore that we still mine today. Every gust of wind, every storm, every tide carried within it the imprint of this alien sky. The world we see in the rocks is the world shaped by air that no animal could survive. Yet, for all its strangeness, the breathless sky was not empty of wonder. Without the filtering effects of oxygen and ozone, sunlight itself may have been harsher, more direct, painting the ground with a brilliance that would hurt our eyes. Nights may have been darker, stars sharper, the Milky Way arching more vividly across the heavens. Meteors would have burned brighter against that thinner protection, streaking across the sky more frequently. To lift your gaze at night would have been to see a universe unsoftened by the filters of modern air. In some ways it may have been more beautiful, even as it was more hostile. It is humbling to think that the air we now breathe was slowly crafted by life itself. Tiny cyanobacteria drifting in ancient oceans began releasing oxygen as a byproduct of their photosynthesis. Over millions upon millions of years, that oxygen leaked into the atmosphere, at first binding with iron and other elements, then slowly, patiently building up. The sky became breathable only because microscopic life made it so. Every breath you take now is a direct gift from those ancient invisible ancestors. The breathless sky was not permanent. It was a stage of transformation, a long inhale before the exhale of oxygen reshaped the planet forever. Let us imagine again standing in that time, surrounded by land bare of plants, oceans strange in their colours, and a sky that feels alien above. There are no scents of pine or grass, no buzzing of bees, no fluttering of wings. The air presses down heavy, filled with gases that would smother us. Yet for the microbes of that age, it was perfect. They lived, multiplied, and thrived under a sky we would call toxic. To them, the earth was already abundant, already alive. The breathless sky was not a flaw but a home. This sky reminds us that what feels hostile to one kind of life may be nurturing to another. We imagine the earth waiting for animals, but in truth the earth was never waiting. It was always alive, always filled with creatures adapted to its current state. The sky that would choke us was, for them, life-giving. It is only with hindsight that we see it as incomplete. As the ages stretched on, the balance began to shift. The breathless sky slowly gave way to one rich with oxygen, one that allowed the rise of fire, of forests, of animals that could run, swim, and fly. But in those long, silent eons before animals, the sky above was a different character altogether. Alien, heavy, breathless. To look at it then would have been to realize how fragile and rare our modern sky is. The blue we see today, the air we breathe, the clouds we watch drift overhead, all of it was earned through billions of years of invisible labor. So the next time you pause and take a deep breath, or glance upward at the clear blue of the atmosphere, remember that it was not always this way. Once, Earth's sky would have stolen your breath instead of sustaining it. Once, the air itself was the greatest barrier to animals existing at all. And yet, through patience and time, that barrier became a doorway. The breathless sky gave way to the sky we know, and with it, the possibility of everything we see alive around us today. 5. The first sparks of life. If the breathless sky set the stage above, then what happened beneath the waters was the true beginning of the story we now call life. Long before animals, long before plants and forests, there were the first sparks, tiny, fragile, almost invisible, but powerful enough to alter the course of a planet. To imagine this moment is to step so far back in time that the Earth itself still felt raw. Continents were small, seas vast, and the chemistry of the world was in constant flux. And yet, within that shifting environment, something remarkable happened. Molecules that had once been lifeless began to dance together in ways that hinted at continuity, at persistence, at the first faint outline of what we would one day call living. Try to picture an ancient shoreline. Waves lap against dark rocks, carrying with them a broth rich in minerals, salts, and organic compounds created by lightning strikes, volcanic eruptions, and even the bombardment of the planet by comets. Each droplet is crowded with possibility. Within shallow pools, heated by the sun by day and cooled by night, simple molecules collide again and again. Most of these collisions come to nothing, dispersing back into the water without leaving a trace. But every once in a while, a pattern sticks. A cluster of molecules forms a bubble around itself, holding together just long enough to try again. These bubbles, primitive cell-like structures, were the first sparks of something greater. They had no eyes to see, no thoughts to guide them, no plan in their motions, and yet, by sheer chance and persistence, some found ways to grow, to divide, to use the energy of sunlight or chemical gradients to continue. These were not animals, not plants, not even what we would truly call cells yet. They were the experiments of the Earth itself, tiny sparks that flickered in the ancient seas. Imagine millions upon millions of them forming, failing, breaking apart, and among them, a few enduring, learning slowly, not with minds but with chemistry, how to persist. The spark of life was not one single event, but a long, patient process. Over millions of years, the seas became laboratories, endlessly experimenting with new forms. Some early microbes found energy in heat and minerals near volcanic vents, thriving where the water boiled and minerals spewed from the Earth's crust. Others drifted near the surface, using sunlight as their fuel, slowly inventing photosynthesis. These tiny architects were not aware of what they were building, yet in their collective work, they reshaped the oceans and eventually the atmosphere. It is strange to think that something so small, so silent, could leave an imprint that would last for billions of years. Picture those first microbial mats forming along shallow coasts. From a distance, they would look like thin, slimy layers clinging to rocks. Step closer, and you would see their surfaces rippled with texture, as layer after layer of microbes stacked themselves, building little domes and ridges we now call stromatolites. These were among the first visible structures created by life, not grand forests or coral reefs, but quiet, layered mounds rising from the shallows. They grew so slowly that to us they would seem frozen in time, but over centuries they spread, leaving behind fossil records that still exist today. Imagine touching one of those stromatolites and realizing you are pressing your hand against a shape that was built by Earth's very first communities of life. And here lies the quiet wonder. The Earth before animals was not empty at all. It was alive with these sparks, these invisible engines of change. They filled the oceans in countless numbers, drifting, dividing, reshaping. To our eyes, the seas may have looked barren, but in truth they were crowded with activity. Every drop of water held millions of lives. Each one was small, yes, but together they were immense. Their presence was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Without them, the animals we are waiting for in this story could never have come to be. Yet these sparks of life were also fragile. Many of them failed. Entire lineages vanished without leaving a trace. Earth itself was harsh. Then oceans churned with storms, continents rumbled with volcanic eruptions, meteorites struck from above, releasing fire and devastation. Each catastrophe threatened to wipe out what little progress had been made. But again and again, life returned. It persisted in the shallows, in the depths, in the hidden corners of the world where conditions were just right. There is a quiet resilience in these sparks. They were not strong, not mighty, not even complex, but they were persistent. And persistence, it turns out, was all that was needed. Imagine, too, the patience of it. We measure our lives in decades, centuries at most, but these sparks stretched across millions upon millions of years. Time was their ally. Where one generation failed, another tried. Where one molecule broke apart, another formed. Each moment carried forward the experiment, slowly increasing the odds that something enduring would appear. If you were to stand beside an ancient pool and watch for a day, a year, a lifetime, you might see nothing change. But step back far enough, watch across millions of years, and you would see something astonishing: the birth of continuity. The moment when chemistry became biology. There is a humility in this story. The Earth did not begin with animals, nor even with plants. It began with sparks too small to see, too fragile to notice, yet powerful enough to alter the course of everything. Without them, there would be no forests, no oceans filled with fish, no birds in the sky, no humans to wonder about it all. The first sparks of life remind us that greatness often begins in silence, in places unseen, with persistence rather than spectacle. And so, when we think of the Earth before animals, let us remember that it was not a barren place waiting passively for us to arrive. It was already alive, already creating, already whispering its first notes of a song that would one day grow louder. The sparks of life were not just beginnings, they were promises, carried forward in every cell of every creature that has lived since. Even now, in your own breath, in your own heartbeat, you carry their legacy. You are, in a very real sense, one of those sparks, carried forward through billions of years of persistence. The Earth was breathless then, its skies heavy, its land bare, but its oceans glowed with invisible light. Life had begun, quietly, patiently, in the smallest of forms, but with the greatest of consequences. Those first sparks still burn within us, reminders that even the humblest beginnings can reshape a world. 6. Microbial architects. When we imagine architects, we picture human hands lifting stone, drawing blueprints, shaping structures into being. But the first architects of Earth were far smaller and far quieter than that. They had no hands, no eyes, no sense of design as we know it. They were microbes, drifting invisibly in oceans, clinging to rocks, multiplying in endless numbers. And yet, in their uncountable multitudes, they built the conditions for everything to follow. They did not raise monuments of stone, but they transformed the air, the oceans, even the very crust of the Earth. These microbial architects shaped the planet more profoundly than any city or civilization ever has. Imagine standing on the edge of an ancient shoreline, long before animals, long before forests. The water laps against the rocks, and at first glance the coast seems barren, untouched. But look closer. On the rocks, thin films shimmer, glistening with a faint sheen in the sunlight. These are microbial mats, layered colonies of tiny organisms living together, their surfaces alive with activity invisible to the naked eye. Some are photosynthesizers, capturing energy from sunlight. Others feed on minerals drawn from the water. Together, they form miniature ecosystems, each layer relying on the waste of the one above, each contributing to the cycle of life. These mats were more than communities, they were engines of transformation. Certain microbes, known today as cyanobacteria, began producing oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. At first, this oxygen was a disaster. It reacted with iron dissolved in the oceans, creating vast rust-red deposits that sank to the seafloor. For the microbes adapted to an oxygen-free world, this new gas was toxic. Imagine an invisible catastrophe spreading across the planet, not with fire or flood, but with the silent release of a gas that poisoned entire lineages. And yet, for others, this oxygen was opportunity. Slowly, over millions of years, life began to adapt. What had been deadly became the foundation for breathing, for energy, for complexity. The work of these microbial architects was patient and immense. Imagine them as invisible masons, laying down bricks not of stone but of oxygen molecules, one by one, until the entire atmosphere was reshaped. This event is sometimes called the Great Oxidation, a turning point in Earth's history when the breathless sky began to change into something animals could one day use. It was not quick. It stretched across hundreds of millions of years, a transformation so slow that it could never be witnessed in a single lifetime. But in the scale of the planet, it was revolutionary. Without it, no lungs would ever have drawn air, no fire would have burned, no animals would have stirred. And the microbes did not stop with air. In the oceans, they built structures we can still see today. Stromatolites, layered mounds created by microbial mats, rose from shallow seas like the first monuments of life. They grew slowly, millimeter by millimeter, as new layers of microbes formed on top of old, trapping sediments and minerals in their sticky surfaces. To walk among these formations would have been to wander through the earliest visible architecture of life, not carved by tools but sculpted by patience. Some stromatolites still exist in remote corners of the world today, living fossils of a time when microbes ruled unchallenged. It is humbling to realize that Earth's landscapes were profoundly altered not by large creatures but by the tiniest of them. The cliffs of banded iron formations we see today, streaked with red and grey, are records of microbial labour, the result of oxygen binding with iron and falling to the seafloor. The very minerals we mine, the ores that fuel our industries, are remnants of that ancient microbial transformation. They were the builders of not just ecosystems, but of the very resources animals and humans would later depend upon. Imagine the patience required. No conscious plan, no guiding intention, only persistence. Billions of tiny cells living, dying, and multiplying, their collective work accumulating into a planetary change. The microbes did not know they were shaping a future. They did not know that their oxygen would someday allow animals to breathe, that their layered mats would become fossils studied by curious descendants billions of years later. And yet, in their smallness, they accomplished more than any empire. Their role as architects went even deeper. In creating oxygen, they also created stress. For many forms of life, oxygen was dangerous, creating reactive molecules that damaged cells. To survive, life had to invent defenses, ways to manage this new element. These defenses eventually became the tools of complexity: respiration, mitochondria, the ability to use oxygen not just to survive, but to fuel more energetic forms of life. In this sense, the microbial architects were not only builders but teachers, forcing life to adapt, to innovate, to prepare for futures they themselves could never see. Think for a moment about your own breath. Each inhale fills your lungs with oxygen carried into your blood, fueling every cell of your body. That simple act, so ordinary to us, is only possible because billions of years ago microbes filled the sky with a gas that once seemed alien. Every fire ever lit, every animal ever born, every moment of running, flying, or swimming, all of it is borrowed from their architecture. We live inside the house they built. And even today, their work continues. Microbes still shape our world in ways we often overlook. They recycle nutrients in the soil, digest food in our stomachs, regulate the chemistry of oceans. They are quieter now, overshadowed by forests and animals, but their role as architects has never ended. They remain the foundation, the builders behind the scenes, the silent partners in the story of life. To imagine Earth without animals is to imagine Earth in their time, when the architects were the rulers, when the world was theirs alone to shape. The air we breathe, the rocks we mine, the very conditions that allowed us to exist are their legacy. They were small, but they were many. They were invisible, but they were powerful. And in their quiet persistence, they built a planet ready for everything that would follow. So let us honour those microbial architects, not as a forgotten prelude, but as the true builders of our world. Their cathedrals were not of stone, but of atmosphere. Their monuments not of marble, but of oxygen and iron. In their silence, they created the conditions for noise. In their invisibility, they laid the foundation for the visible. Without them, animals would never have been possible. Without them, we would not be here to wonder. 7. Alien colours of early Earth. When we picture our planet today, we see familiar shades: green forests, blue oceans, white clouds drifting across a pale sky. These colours feel so natural, so inevitable, that it's difficult to imagine Earth any other way. But in the ages before animals, the Earth wore a palette that would look alien to our eyes. The seas, the skies, and the very rocks of the continents shimmered with hues unfamiliar to us. Life itself painted the world in unexpected colours, sometimes purple, sometimes red, sometimes strange shades that might have made the planet look less like the Earth we know, and more like a world from a distant star. Imagine standing by an ancient ocean in those early days. The water does not gleam with the deep blue we are used to, but instead reflects a reddish or greenish tint, depending on its chemistry at the time. Without oxygen to bind with iron, the seas were often filled with dissolved metals. Iron, in particular, gave the oceans a rusty glow, making them appear more like vast basins of blood than the sapphire expanses we know. In other ages, purple bacteria dominated the surface, turning shallow waters into lavender pools under the sunlight. To us it would have looked strange, even unsettling, but to the microbes of the time this was abundance, a world perfectly suited to their way of life. The land, too, was painted in colours that might surprise us. Without carpets of green plants, the continents were exposed canvases of stone. Volcanic plains spread black and glossy across the surface, shimmering when fresh and dulling as they cooled. Mineral deposits stained cliffs and hillsides with streaks of orange, red and yellow. In some places, thin microbial mats clung to damp rocks, colouring them with browns, purples and even iridescent sheens. Imagine walking through this landscape, your eyes searching for green, for something familiar, and finding none. The earth itself seemed painted in mineral tones, metallic and raw, more like the surface of Mars than the gardened planet we now call home. And then there was the sky. Without oxygen and ozone to filter sunlight, the atmosphere scattered light differently. At times, methane haze filled the air, giving the sky a reddish or orange cast. Sunsets may have burned deeper and stranger, not soft golds and pinks, but fiery crimsons or even purples. During the day, the sunlight itself may have looked harsher, whiter, more direct, unfiltered by the layers we now depend on. At night, however, the stars may have appeared brighter, sharper, their light cutting through the thinner protection. Imagine a Milky Way so vivid it glowed like a river of light, unblurred by modern air. In one sense, the world was more alien. In another, more dazzling. What makes these colours so fascinating is that they were not merely accidents of chemistry. They were the direct result of life itself. Microbes were painting the oceans, tinting them purple, green or red as they spread. Their pigments absorbed different wavelengths of sunlight, competing for energy in waters crowded with rivals. Some absorbed the red light, some the blue, each carving out a niche in the ancient seas. To us, these colours would look alien, but they were the hues of survival, each shade a strategy in the quiet battle for existence. It is humbling to think that the earth we now call blue and green was once purple and red. Entire epochs may have passed when purple seas stretched across the horizon, their surfaces glistening with microbial life, while the skies above glowed with unfamiliar tones. If an observer from another world had looked at Earth then, they might not have recognized it as the same planet. They might have thought it barren or lifeless, not realizing that its alien colors were signs of thriving communities invisible to the naked eye. Even today, traces of these colors remain. Stromatolites in shallow waters still carry faint hues of brown and green, their layers tinted by the microbes living within them. Some modern bacteria still produce the pigments of their ancestors, turning ponds purple or red under the right conditions. They are echoes of a time when the whole world shimmered with such hues, when Earth's palette was more diverse, more strange than it is now. We carry those pigments forward too, in ways we rarely think about: chlorophyll in plants, hemoglobin in our blood. The colours of life have always been bound to survival. To imagine walking through that world is to feel disoriented at first. We are so accustomed to the soothing green of vegetation that its absence feels stark. Instead, our eyes would meet harsh mineral reds, volcanic blacks, rusty seas, purple shallows. Yet after a while, perhaps we would find a different kind of beauty in it. The earth was raw then, honest in its colours, painted by chemistry and microbes rather than leaves and forests. It was a world still in the act of becoming, each shade a step toward the palette we now call familiar. There is also a reminder in these alien colours that what seems normal is only temporary. The blue of our oceans, the green of our forests, the clear skies we cherish, these are but one version of Earth, one moment in its long history. For billions of years, the planet looked utterly different. For billions more, it may change again. The Earth has never been fixed in appearance. It has always been a canvas, repainted again and again by life, by air, by stone. The colours we see today are just the latest chapter in an ongoing story. And so, when you close your eyes and try to picture the world before animals, don't imagine it as empty. Imagine it instead as vividly alien, a world alive with strange hues, its seas and skies shimmering with unfamiliar light. It was not the garden we know now, but it was beautiful in its own way, painted not for our eyes but for the microbes that called it home. The alien colours of early Earth remind us that life is not only about survival but about transformation. In their quiet persistence, those tiny architects painted the world, each pigment a brushstroke in the long masterpiece of Earth's history. 8. The endless age of microbes. When we think about the history of life, our minds often leap to the grand and dramatic, the age of dinosaurs, the rise of mammals, the first humans carving their stories into the earth. But those are fleeting chapters, moments near the end of a book that stretches far longer than we can truly imagine. For most of Earth's history, life was not filled with giants or forests or animals of any kind. For billions of years, life belonged to microbes alone. It was an age of patience, of persistence, of quiet dominance, and it lasted longer than all the later ages combined. To understand the Earth before animals, we must linger in this endless age, where life was simple in form but profound in impact. Imagine waking up in that time, though to us, the word waking would be misplaced. There were no mornings marked by birdsong, no evenings softened by the hum of insects. The planet's soundtrack was almost entirely geological. The crash of waves, the hiss of volcanic gases, the distant rumble of shifting crust. And yet, beneath this seeming emptiness, the world was overflowing with life. It just happened to be life too small for human eyes to see. Every drop of water held millions of tiny organisms. Every tide pool, every shallow sea, every vent in the deep ocean was crowded with invisible multitudes. These microbes were not passive. They competed, they adapted, they invented strategies that still shape life today. Some found ways to use sunlight, splitting molecules and releasing oxygen, changing the chemistry of the air itself. Others learned to draw energy from minerals, thriving in the deep darkness where light never reached. They formed mats that clung stubbornly to rocks, covering shorelines with living film. They built stromatolites, those layered mounds that still stand in some places today as monuments to their persistence. The age of microbes was not empty or still. It was restless, inventive, and quietly revolutionary. And it lasted so long. To put it in perspective, if you condensed Earth's 4.5 billion years into a single day, microbes would appear in the early morning and dominate until almost nightfall. Animals would only arrive in the final hours, humans in the last seconds before midnight. The vast sweep of history was theirs. They were the rulers of the Earth for nearly 3 billion years, far longer than any dynasty or empire we could imagine. From their perspective, animals are the newcomers, the brief experiment that may or may not endure. During this endless age, whole dramas played out beyond our sight. Imagine lineages of microbes rising to dominance, spreading across the seas, only to fade when conditions changed. Imagine the invention of new metabolisms, new pigments, new ways of surviving. Each tiny cell carried the possibility of innovation, and with billions upon billions of them, the planet became a vast laboratory. Some of these inventions still define us today: photosynthesis, respiration, DNA as the code of life. They were not accidents, but the slow accumulation of countless experiments across unimaginable spans of time. The Earth itself bore witness to these changes. The great oxidation, triggered by microbes, reshaped the atmosphere and oceans. Iron fell out of the seas, settling into banded deposits that remained locked in stone. The skies turned blue for the first time, a colour born from oxygen scattering sunlight. The air grew breathable, though no creature yet existed to breathe it. It was a paradox, the architects of the world, creating conditions that would one day support animals, while themselves remaining small and unseen. If you could stand on the shores of that world and watch, you might see little to mark the passage of time. The same mats would cling to rocks, the same ripples would stretch across the seas. 1,000 years might pass without obvious change. And yet, in the hidden realm of the microscopic, everything was in motion. Cells divided, mutations occurred, adaptations spread. The world of microbes is a world of constant renewal, each moment carrying the seeds of the next. It is easy for us to overlook this age because it does not fit our sense of drama. We long for spectacle, for creatures that swim and walk and fly. But the truth is that the greatest drama of all may have been here, in the endless patience of the small. By the time animals arrived, the groundwork had already been laid. The atmosphere had been reshaped, the oceans stocked with nutrients, the cycles of carbon and nitrogen stabilized. The microbial age was not a prelude, it was the foundation. Without it, animals would never have been possible. Even today, microbes remain the quiet rulers. They are older than us, more numerous, more adaptable. They live in the soil beneath our feet, in the air we breathe, in the depths of the ocean, and even in our own bodies. They persist in places animals cannot, inside boiling springs, within frozen ice, in rocks buried miles below the surface. They are survivors of extremes, inheritors of the Earth's deepest history. And though animals now dominate the visible world, microbes still hold the invisible one. In many ways, the microbial age has never truly ended. To imagine Earth in that time is to imagine patience itself. Time stretching beyond comprehension, changes unfolding not in moments but in millions of years. Yet within that patience, there was progress, slow and steady. Life was teaching itself endurance, testing its strategies, preparing for leaps that would come much later. It is humbling to think that our entire existence rests on their persistence. Every breath, every heartbeat, every step is possible because microbes spent billions of years shaping a world that could hold us. The endless age of microbes teaches us something else, too, that life does not always need spectacle to be extraordinary. Sometimes it is the small, the unseen, the quiet that carries the greatest weight. Sometimes the most profound transformations happen not in a rush, but in a slow unfolding, like a whisper that lasts for billions of years. When we think of Earth before animals, let us not see it as empty, but as filled beyond measure with life too small for us to notice. Life that was already thriving, already experimenting, already building a future. And so, as we move through the story of Earth, let us pause here in gratitude for the long patience of that age. An age not of roaring beasts or towering forests, but of cells drifting in the seas, clinging to rocks, painting the world in strange colours. An age that lasted longer than all the others, and without which none of the others could have existed at all. The endless age of microbes was not just a beginning, it was most of the story, and in many ways, it is still being written, even now. 9. Snowball Earth. There are moments in Earth's story when the planet itself seems to hold its breath, when conditions shift so drastically that the world becomes almost unrecognizable. One of the most dramatic of these chapters arrived long before animals, during a time when the Earth may have been transformed into a sphere of ice. Scientists call this event Snowball Earth, and while its details are still the subject of debate, the picture it paints is both haunting and beautiful. Imagine the entire planet locked in white, oceans frozen over, continents buried under ice sheets, skies heavy with cold. It is almost impossible to picture such a world as alive, and yet life endured through it, holding on in small hidden corners, waiting patiently for the thaw. Imagine standing on the edge of a coastline during this frozen era. The waves are gone, the water sealed beneath a lid of ice that stretches out toward the horizon. The familiar sparkle of the sea is replaced by a pale, blinding glare. Where once storms rolled across open waters, now the air is brittle with frost, the silence broken only by the groaning creak of glaciers shifting as they press toward the sea. Mountains are draped in thick white, valleys filled with frozen rivers. From space, the Earth would have gleamed like a great pearl, dazzling and silent, a snowball adrift in the darkness of space. The cause of this planetary freeze lies in the delicate balance of atmosphere and sunlight. Before animals, the Earth's air was still adjusting to the oxygen released by microbes. Shifts in volcanic activity, continental positions, and the drawdown of greenhouse gases may have tipped the balance toward cold. With less carbon dioxide to trap heat, ice crept outward from the poles, reflecting more sunlight into space, which in turn cooled the planet further. The freeze fed on itself until almost the entire globe was sealed in ice. It was a feedback loop of breathtaking scale, a reminder of how fragile the climate of a planet can be. And yet, for all its severity, Snowball Earth was not truly the end. Life found ways to survive even in that frozen silence. Beneath the thick sheets of ice, the oceans were not entirely dead. Heat from volcanic vents and the planet's own geothermal energy kept pockets of water liquid. Around these refuges, microbes clung to existence, feeding on chemical energy in the dark. In shallower regions, where the ice may have been thinner, light could still filter through, allowing photosynthetic microbes to endure. Imagine them like tiny embers glowing in the dark of a long winter, small but persistent, carrying life through the coldest age the Earth had ever known. The landscapes of Snowball Earth would have felt alien. The seas, normally restless with waves and tides, were frozen still, a silence so deep it would seem eternal. The land, stripped of plants, was buried under glaciers that stretched for thousands of miles. Winds scoured the frozen surface, carrying fine snow across endless plains of ice. The air itself may have been sharper, clearer, carrying sound farther but duller in tone. No animals yet existed to suffer the cold, no forests to wither, but the microbes endured, hidden from the eye yet unyielding in their quiet strength. What is astonishing is how long this frozen age may have lasted. Some estimates suggest tens of millions of years, an expanse of time so vast that it dwarfs the rise and fall of entire animal lineages that would come later. To imagine Earth locked in ice for so long is to imagine patience at a scale beyond comprehension. Generations upon generations of microbes lived and died in that frozen world, never knowing anything else. To them, this was simply life. It was the only Earth they had ever known. And then, slowly, change returned. Volcanic eruptions continued beneath the ice, releasing carbon dioxide into the air. With the ocean sealed, that carbon dioxide could not be drawn down by weathering as it normally would. Instead, it accumulated in the atmosphere, building like pressure behind a dam. Eventually, the greenhouse effect returned with overwhelming force, warming the planet until the ice began to retreat. Imagine the first cracks forming in the frozen seas, the first rivulets of meltwater carving channels across the glaciers, the sound of liquid water returning after millions of years of silence. Slowly, the white shell began to break. The thaw was dramatic. As ice melted, it released massive floods, carving valleys and carrying sediments into the seas. Oceans roared back to life, waves crashing again against the land. The sudden influx of nutrients washed into the water from glacial melt may have fueled blooms of microbes, surges of life spreading across the seas with renewed vigour. After so long in hibernation, the world opened again, and life seized the opportunity. Some scientists believe that the aftermath of Snowball Earth may even have set the stage for the rise of multicellular organisms, the first steps toward animals. The stress of surviving in such extremes may have encouraged innovation, preparing life for the leaps to come. To imagine Earth in this frozen chapter is to feel both awe and unease. Awe at the scale of transformation, at a planet shimmering like glass under the sun, its silence profound and its beauty stark. Unease at the thought of how easily climate can shift, how fragile the balance of warmth and cold truly is. And yet, there is also comfort here. Life did not end in the snowball, it endured, it adapted, it waited. That resilience is written into every living thing today, carried forward from ancestors who survived the frozen silence. Even now, we see reminders of that age. Glacial deposits from billions of years ago, striated rocks carved by ice, chemical signatures in ancient stones, all of them whisper of a time when the Earth was white from pole to pole. They remind us that our planet has been many worlds, each strange in its own way, each carrying life through to the next. Snowball Earth was not a pause but a crucible, a test of survival, a shaping force in the long story of life. So let us picture it not only as a frozen prison, but as a quiet chapter of preparation. The Earth was wrapped in silence, yes, but also in possibility. Beneath the ice, in the darkness, life held its ground. When the thaw came, it emerged ready for more, ready to step slowly toward the complexity that would one day fill the seas with animals. Snowball Earth was not the end of the story, but the deep, cold breath before the world exhaled into abundance. 10. Volcanoes as lifelines. When we hear the word volcano, we often think of destruction eruptions that bury cities, rivers of molten rock that consume forests, clouds of ash that blot out the Sunday. They are fiery, violent, reminders of Earth's restlessness. But in the ages before animals, volcanoes were not just forces of ruin. They were also lifelines, sources of heat, energy, and chemistry that allowed life to endure when the planet itself seemed harsh and unwelcoming. Without volcanoes, life might never have survived the frozen stretches of Snowball Earth, nor thrived in the deep oceans where sunlight could not reach. To picture this chapter of the Earth's story, we must descend into the dark places where fire met water and life found its hidden havens. Imagine a world sealed in ice, the oceans capped by a thick white shell that blocks out the sunday. On the surface, silence reigns, a frozen desert stretching across the globe. But plunge down beneath the ice, and the story changes. In the darkness of the ocean floor, cracks in the Earth's crust open into vents, and from these vents, heat and minerals pour outward in billowing plumes. Black smokers, as we call them today, rise like chimneys in the deep, spewing superheated water rich in iron, sulfur, and other elements. Around them, life clings to existence. Microbes gather in the warmth, feeding not on sunlight but on chemistry, drawing energy from reactions with sulfur and metals. In the bleakest of ages, these volcanic havens were pockets of survival, lifeboats of heat in a frozen sea. These undersea volcanoes did more than keep life alive. They taught it new strategies. In a world where sunlight could not always be relied upon, microbes learned to live on chemical energy instead. This process, called chemosynthesis, became a foundation of life in the deep oceans. Even now, billions of years later, ecosystems thrive around hydrothermal vents, where creatures from giant tube worms to ghostly crabs depend on microbes that feed on volcanic chemistry. The roots of these ecosystems trace back to the time before animals, when volcanoes acted as teachers as well as lifelines. But volcanoes shaped more than the deep. On land, their eruptions poured gases into the air, gases that altered the atmosphere in ways both dangerous and life-giving. Carbon dioxide, released in great quantities, trapped heat, preventing the planet from freezing forever during Snowball Earth. Each eruption was like a match, struck in the darkness, releasing the greenhouse warmth that eventually melted the ice and brought back open oceans. Without those eruptions, Earth might have remained locked in ice, silent and lifeless on its surface. Instead, the volcanoes provided a way forward, a slow but steady infusion of heat and breath into a struggling world. Picture the landscape of that time. Jagged peaks, freshly formed from molten stone, steam rising as lava met water, new islands bursting from the sea in fire and ash. To us, it might seem desolate, a scene of ruin, but for microbes, it was possibility. Each eruption scattered minerals across the land, feeding rivers that carried nutrients into the seas. Each new island was a canvas for microbial mats to colonize, spreading their thin films across the cooling rock. In this way, volcanoes were not only destroyers but also creators, painting the land with new surfaces, seeding the oceans with fuel. Even the very air we breathe today carries the signature of volcanoes. They were among the first to release gases that built the atmosphere: carbon dioxide, nitrogen, water vapor, even small traces of methane and sulfur. It was a volatile mix, sometimes hostile, but it was the raw material from which life could shape its world. Without volcanoes, the atmosphere might never have developed into the balance we know now. Every inhale we take carries the legacy of their long, fiery breath. There is a paradox here, one that Earth seems to embody again and again. The same forces that threaten life also sustain it. Volcanoes can smother, but they can also nourish. They can plunge skies into darkness with ash, but they can also fertilize oceans with iron. They can bury land in molten rock, but in doing so, they create fresh surfaces for life to explore. In the time before animals, this paradox was especially clear. Life clung to volcanoes for warmth and survival, even as their eruptions reshaped the planet in sudden, violent bursts. To imagine walking through such a world is to feel both awe and caution. The ground trembles, smoke rises in plumes, lava glows against the horizon. There are no forests to burn, no animals to flee, only stone cracking open under immense pressure. The air is sharp with sulfur, the skies stained with ash. And yet, at the edges of cooling flows, microbes spread quietly, thriving in the mineral-rich pools left behind. What to us would feel like danger was to them a gift. This reliance on volcanoes also reminds us of life's adaptability. When the planet froze, microbes turned to vents for heat. When the air was thick with gases, they learned to use them as fuel. When new land erupted from the sea, they colonized it without hesitation. Life did not wait for perfect conditions. It used what was available, even if it came in the form of fire and ash. Volcanoes were lifelines, not because they were gentle, but because they offered opportunity. Life seized it, and in doing so, ensured its survival through ages of hardship. Even now, we carry this volcanic inheritance. The nutrients in our soils, the iron in our blood, the carbon that cycles through our bodies, all of it was once released from deep within the earth by volcanic fire. Our world is not separate from those eruptions. It was built by them, sustained by them, shaped by them. They are not simply features of geology, but vital threads in the story of life. So when we think of the earth before animals, let us not imagine a barren wasteland, but a world alive with fire and chemistry. A world where volcanoes, in their ferocity, provided warmth to the frozen seas, nutrients to the barren land, and gases to the forming sky. They were the lifelines of a planet still young, the heartbeat beneath the surface that never stopped pulsing. Without them, life might have flickered out in the cold. With them, it persisted, grew, and prepared for the chapters yet to come. Volcanoes remind us that survival is often found in unlikely places, that what appears destructive may also be the source of renewal. In their fiery breath, life found its way forward, and in their echoes, we still live today. 11. A different rhythm of time. When we measure time today, we do it by the rhythms of life around us. The rising and setting of the sun is marked by birdsong at dawn and crickets at dusk. Seasons are painted by the greening of forests in spring, the buzzing of insects in summer, the migration of animals in autumn, and the quiet sleep of plants in winter. Even our sense of days and years is tied to the motions of living things, from the heartbeat of a mammal to the flowering of a meadow. But in the ages before animals, before forests and flowers, Earth kept time differently. It was a world where the rhythms were geological, chemical, and celestial rather than biological. To live in such a world would have been to experience time on a scale both slower and stranger than what we know. Imagine waking on a barren shore. The sky above is vast and heavy with gases, its colours alien compared to our blue. The land is bare stone, untouched by roots or grass. The only sound is the sigh of wind and the steady crash of waves. There are no cicadas to measure summer afternoons, no frogs to announce the rains. Time here is marked not by animals but by the slower pulse of the planet itself. Days are defined by the sweep of the sun and the shadows it casts on rock. Nights are illuminated by a moon that was closer then, tugging tides with a force much greater than today. The rising and falling of the oceans under that pull was one of the earliest, most reliable rhythms, a clock written in water long before any animal knew how to listen. Those tides may have been immense, surging inland far more than they do now, retreating with a force that reshaped coasts again and again. For microbes clinging to rocks and forming mats in tidal flats, this was the rhythm of life, the gentle flooding that carried nutrients in, the draining that left them exposed to the air. Millions of times over, these tides repeated, a cosmic metronome set by the dance between Earth and Moon. Animals would one day evolve to follow such patterns, crabs scuttling to the rhythm of the tide, turtles laying eggs by the pull of the moonlight. But in this early world, the rhythm was already there, long before anything had learned to dance to it. The seasons, too, were different. Without forests to change colour, without migrations to follow, seasons revealed themselves in more subtle ways. Perhaps the winds shifted with temperature, carrying dust across continents. Perhaps the chemistry of shallow pools changed as the sun grew stronger in summer and weaker in winter. Volcanic eruptions might have added their own rhythms, releasing bursts of ash and gas that dimmed the sun for years at a time. These cycles were not the lively, visible transitions we know today. They were quieter, slower, less obvious, but no less real. And then there were the rhythms too vast for any single being to notice. Continents drifted, colliding and separating across millions of years. Mountains rose inch by inch and were worn down again by wind and rain. Oceans opened and closed, swallowing coastlines and revealing new lands. To the microbes of that age, these shifts would have been imperceptible, far beyond the span of their fragile lives. Yet on the scale of the earth itself, these were the deepest rhythms, a slow breathing of stone and water that has never stopped. In a world without animals, silence amplified these slower beats. Imagine standing in a place where nothing moved except the wind, where no rustle in the grass marked the passing of a creature, where no wing beat cut the air. It might feel timeless, as though the world were frozen. But if you stayed long enough, if you could stretch your sense of time to match the planets, you would begin to notice the patterns. The cycles of tides, the weathering of rock, the spreading of microbial mats across a pool, the faint shifts in air as new gases accumulated. These were the clocks of the pre-animal world. Even the length of a day itself was different. Billions of years ago, the Earth spun faster. A day was not 24 hours, but perhaps as short as 18. The Moon, closer to Earth, pulled harder, gradually slowing the planet's rotation. Imagine sunsets arriving sooner, nights passing more quickly, time itself moving at a different pace. For the microbes drifting in the seas, these shorter days and nights were the only reality they knew. For us, it would be disorienting. A reminder that even something as steady as a day is not fixed but changes over deep time. What is striking is how much patience this world required. To us, life seems full of movement, seeds sprouting, animals migrating, people building and creating. But in the world before animals, patience was everything. Entire millennia could pass with only subtle shifts in the balance of gases, or slight expansions of microbial colonies, or slow accumulations of oxygen in the air. To live then would have meant existing in a time that did not rush, a time where change came not in bursts but in waves that spanned millions of years. It was a different rhythm entirely, one that we can glimpse only when we step back far enough from our own hurried pace. And yet, in its slowness, this rhythm carried the seeds of everything to come. Each tide, each volcanic cycle, each subtle change in atmosphere built toward a future where animals would finally appear. The quiet repetition of these patterns prepared the stage. The endless patience of microbes, the steady breath of volcanoes, and the gradual cooling and warming of climates. All of it was rhythm. All of it was time. It was just not time as we measure it now. Perhaps this is why imagining the pre-animal Earth can feel soothing. It was a world without haste, a world content to unfold in its own way, at its own pace. There was no urgency, no rush toward complexity. There was only the long rhythm of a planet alive, shaping itself slowly, quietly. When we think of that age, we are reminded that not all progress is fast, not all beauty is immediate. Sometimes the greatest transformations come from rhythms so slow we cannot feel them, only trust that they are happening. So the world before animals was not timeless, but it kept a different time, a time written in tides and tectonics, in chemistry and silence, a time without the heartbeat of creatures, but with the steady pulse of the earth itself. That rhythm carried forward, patient and unbroken, until the day came when animals finally joined the dance. 12. The first multicellular experiments. Up until now, life on Earth had been small. The seas were crowded with microbes, single-celled beings that had mastered chemistry in countless ways. They had painted the oceans in alien colours, filled the air with oxygen, and endured ages of fire and ice. But for billions of years, that was all life was: tiny, invisible, simple. Then, slowly, something began to change. Cells that had once lived only on their own began to join together, forming fragile partnerships. These were not yet animals, not even plants as we know them, but they were something new, multicellular life, the first experiments in complexity. Imagine drifting in an ancient ocean during this time. To the naked eye, the water looks empty. No fish dart past, no jellyfish pulse in the shallows, no seaweed sways with the tide. Yet if you could magnify your vision, you would see something remarkable unfolding. Clusters of cells are sticking together, moving not as individuals but as groups. At first, these clusters are little more than colonies, loose gatherings that divide the labour of survival. Some cells gather energy, others anchor the colony to a surface, others specialise in reproduction. It is a fragile arrangement, easily broken, but it represents something new, the beginnings of cooperation. This shift may not sound dramatic, but it changed everything. A single cell can do only so much. It can survive, it can replicate, but it is limited in size and function. By joining forces, cells could grow larger, explore new forms, and experiment with new ways of living. Some of these clusters formed simple filaments, strings of cells linked end to end. Others became flat sheets, like living carpets drifting in the water. Over time, some developed into hollow spheres, their cells forming a delicate skin around an empty centre. These shapes were the first whispers of bodies, the earliest attempts at form. The ocean became a laboratory of possibilities. Each cluster of cells was a tiny experiment, testing whether cooperation could offer advantages over solitude. Many failed. The bonds between cells broke apart, or the energy demands became too high, or the structures collapsed under stress. But some endured, and those few were the ancestors of all multicellular life. From their fragile beginnings came corals, forests, whales, and eventually us. It is humbling to think that our own bodies, with their trillions of specialized cells, are the distant legacy of those first hesitant experiments in teamwork. Imagine one of these simple organisms, perhaps resembling a sponge, anchored to the seafloor. It has no nervous system, no muscles, no eyes. It does not move, but it filters water through its body, drawing out nutrients. Its cells have divided the work. Some pump, some digest, some form the outer walls. This is not yet an animal, but it is a blueprint, a prototype of what would one day become animals. It is as if life were sketching ideas in the margins before writing the full story. These early multicellular beings were fragile, soft-bodied, leaving behind only faint traces in the fossil record. Yet even those faint traces speak of innovation. They tell us that life was no longer content to remain small. It was reaching, tentatively, for size, for form, for complexity. Each cluster of cells was a conversation, an agreement to work together, to share survival instead of facing it alone. Cooperation became as important as competition, and from that balance, new possibilities emerged. The world around them was changing too. Oxygen levels in the oceans were slowly rising, creating opportunities for larger bodies that required more energy. Nutrients washed into the seas from eroding land, feeding microbial blooms that in turn nourished multicellular life. The stage was set, though no one yet knew it, for the great explosion of diversity that would eventually follow. For now, the experiments were small, quiet, barely noticeable, but their importance was immense. It is easy to overlook how radical this step was. A single-celled organism is a universe unto itself, carrying all it needs within its tiny structure. To give up some of that independence, to rely on neighbors, was a profound shift. It required communication between cells. Signals passed back and forth to coordinate growth and function. It required trust, in a way, that the group would benefit from cooperation. Not all attempts worked, but those that did created the foundation for bodies far larger and more complex than a lone cell could ever achieve. Think of your own body for a moment. Trillions of cells, each alive in its own right, each carrying the same genetic instructions, yet each playing a different role. Muscle cells contract, nerve cells transmit signals, skin cells form a barrier. None of them could survive long on their own, but together they form a person. That miracle of cooperation began here, in the ancient seas, when the first cells decided to work together. The first multicellular experiments were the opening lines of a story we are still part of today. What is striking is how unhurried it all was. This shift did not happen overnight. It took hundreds of millions of years for multicellular life to become stable, for cooperation to refine itself into complexity. For long stretches, Earth remained a microbial world, with multicellular organisms as rare, fragile exceptions. And yet, those exceptions persisted, testing new forms, slowly improving their strategies. Life was in no rush, and in that patience, it built something extraordinary. To imagine the oceans of that time is to imagine potential. They looked empty to us, perhaps even barren, but within them swam the beginnings of bodies, the seeds of complexity. The silence of the pre-animal Earth was not wasted. It was the sound of life preparing, sketching, rehearsing. The first multicellular experiments were not the grand performance, but they were the tuning of instruments before the music began. And so, when we think of Earth before animals, let us not see it as static. Let us see it as a place of quiet invention, of small steps that carried immense weight. The first sparks of cooperation, the first attempts at building something larger than a single cell, the first whispers of what would one day fill the oceans with movement and sound. These early experiments remind us that life is not just about survival, it is about imagination, about trying new forms, about reaching toward what seems impossible. From those fragile beginnings came sponges, jellyfish, fish, and eventually us. All of it began with clusters of cells drifting in ancient seas, testing the power of togetherness. The first multicellular experiments were the beginning of bodies, the beginning of form, the beginning of animals. They were small, quiet, almost invisible, but they changed everything. 13. A world of quiet shores. The shoreline has always been a place of meeting. It is where land greets sea, where waves break and retreat, where tides carry stories from one realm to another. Today, we think of shores as lively spaces, beaches scattered with shells, seabirds circling overhead, crabs digging in the sand, forests pressing close to the water's edge. But in the ages before animals, the shores of Earth were places of quiet, unlike anything we know now. They were edges of stone and tide without footprints, without wings overhead, without the rustle of reeds or grasses. To stand on such a shore would have been to feel the immensity of silence, a world defined only by wind, water, and the faint persistence of microbes clinging to the margins. Imagine approaching one of these early coasts. The land is bare rock, fractured and sharp, shaped by volcanic birth and worn by endless waves. There is no sand, for sand requires the grinding of shells, and no animals yet existed to build them. Instead, the ground is strewn with pebbles and shards of stone, rough underfoot, washed smooth only in places where water has worked longest. Pools of seawater gather in shallow depressions, warmed by the sun, and in their stillness, strange films glisten. These are microbial mats, thin layers of life spread like carpets across the stone. To us, they would appear slimy, coloured in shades of green, brown, or even purple. To the early Earth, they were pioneers, the first colonizers of the shoreline. The air is quiet. Waves crash, yes, and winds whistle, but no gull cries break the rhythm, no insect hum fills the gaps. There are no scuttling footsteps, no sudden splashes of creatures diving into the shallows. Each sound is purely geological, the song of water and stone. It is an austere beauty, stripped of the chorus we now expect at a coast. Time feels slower here, stretched out across tides that rise and fall without witnesses to notice them. The moon pulls at the water as it always has, creating cycles as old as the planet itself, but no animal yet has learned to follow its rhythm. And yet, these shores were not empty. Look closer at the tidal pools, and you would see them alive with microbial colonies. Some form flat films on the rocks, others create layered domes, stromatolites slowly building structures millimetre by millimetre. When the tide rises, they are submerged, capturing energy from sunlight filtered through the waves. When the tide falls, they lie exposed, glistening under the open sky, enduring dryness until the sea returns. These simple communities were the first to test the boundary between water and land, the first to see if life could endure where the two worlds touched. Their work was quiet but transformative. By spreading across rocks and tidal flats, these microbes began the long process of breaking down minerals, creating the earliest hints of soil. By releasing oxygen as a byproduct of their photosynthesis, they enriched the air above, drop by invisible drop. Each mat was like a breath, exhaled into the world, preparing it for what would one day come. From the perspective of deep time, these quiet shores were workshops, laboratories where life rehearsed for its eventual leap onto land. If you walked along such a coastline, the sight might unsettle you. The absence of movement would feel uncanny. The horizon would be empty of wings, the water empty of fins breaking the surface. The beach would carry no footprints, only the marks of waves. Even the smell would be different. No tang of rotting seaweed, no sharp scent of salt mixed with the musk of creatures. Instead, the air would smell of minerals, of stone, of gases from volcanic vents. And yet, beneath the surface of every pool, life was humming, invisible to the naked eye but persistent in its quiet work. The rhythm of these shores was written not in creatures, but in cycles of water. Twice a day, the tide surged in, flooding the rocks, submerging microbial mats, feeding them with nutrients from the sea. Twice a day, the tide retreated, leaving them exposed, vulnerable, but still clinging on. Over countless generations, this cycle repeated. It was a training ground for endurance, a place where life learned to survive in conditions that shifted between wet and dry, between safety and exposure. In this way, the quiet shores became classrooms, teaching microbes lessons that would one day allow plants to root in soil and animals to crawl from the sea. It is worth pausing to consider how long this went on. For millions of years, the shores remained silent, visited only by waves and wind. For millions more, microbial mats spread and withdrew, building stromatolites layer by layer. To us, a shore without animals might seem unfinished, waiting for life to arrive. But from the perspective of those microbes, the shores were already alive, already complete in their own right. They had no sense of what was missing, only the rhythm of their own survival. The silence we notice would not have been silence to them. It was a world filled with their own quiet activity. Even today, we can glimpse echoes of that ancient world. In remote parts of Australia, stromatolites still rise from shallow waters, living fossils of a time when they dominated coastlines. To stand near them is to look back billions of years, to see what the shores once looked like when life was young. They remind us that our sense of normal is temporary, that the bustling beaches we know are only one version of Earth. There was a time, long and patient, when quiet was the rule, and microbial mats were the most complex communities on land. These quiet shores were places of preparation. The oxygen they exhaled would one day make the air breathable. The soil they began to form would one day nourish plants. The endurance they demonstrated at the boundary of land and sea would one day be inherited by creatures ready to take their first steps onto dry ground. They may not have been crowded with movement or noise, but they were alive with promise. So when we imagine the world before animals, let us not think of its shores as empty. Let us see them as they were lined with stone, washed by tides, painted with microbial films, silent but not lifeless. They were edges of possibility, where the sea whispered to the land and life began to listen. A world of quiet shores, patient, waiting, and yet already alive with the beginnings of what would come. 14. The gift of oxygen. If there is one element that defines the difference between the world before animals and the world after, it is oxygen. We breathe it with every moment, so deeply woven into our survival that we rarely pause to notice it. Fire depends on it. Energy flows through our bodies because of it, and the very colour of the sky is shaped by it. But in Earth's early days, oxygen was not the gift we know. It was a novelty, an experiment, even a poison. Its arrival reshaped the planet forever, opening the way for animals, yet also bringing catastrophe to the forms of life that came before. To understand the world before animals, we must linger at this turning point, when oxygen slowly changed from an invisible gas to the breath of the future. Imagine the Earth billions of years ago. The sky above is heavy, not the familiar pale blue, but tinged with reds and oranges from methane haze. The seas below are rich in dissolved iron, their waters tinted green or rust-coloured depending on where you look. Microbes rule this world, filling every tide pool, drifting in every current, forming vast mats along the coasts. For ages they have thrived without oxygen. Their metabolisms are tuned to other fuels, sulfur, hydrogen, carbon dioxide. To them, oxygen is unnecessary, even harmful, and then, quietly, some microbes begin to release it. Cyanobacteria, sometimes called blue-green algae, learn to use sunlight in a new way. They split water molecules, capturing energy and releasing oxygen as a waste product. At first, that oxygen did not build up in the air. It reacted with iron in the seas, falling out of the water in vast deposits of rust that sank to the ocean floor. For millions of years this continued, painting the Earth's rocks with the layered red and grey stripes we call banded iron formations. Even today, we mine those ancient deposits, cutting into the record of oxygen's first stirrings. Each layer is a page in the story of life, reshaping its own planet. But eventually, the iron was used up. With fewer places to hide, oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere. Slowly, invisibly, it gathered, drop by drop, breath by breath, until the very air was changed. This was both gift and catastrophe. For the microbes that had no defense against oxygen, it was deadly. Oxygen is a reactive gas, damaging to delicate cells that had evolved in its absence. Entire lineages of life were poisoned, driven into extinction, or forced into oxygen-free niches deep underground or in sealed-off sediments. It was one of the first great die-offs in Earth's history, a reminder that even progress comes with loss. And yet, for others, oxygen was opportunity. New metabolisms evolved, ones that used oxygen not as a poison but as a source of energy. Respiration was born, a process far more powerful than the older methods of extracting energy from the environment. With respiration, cells could grow larger, move more actively, and eventually cooperate in more complex forms. Oxygen became the key that unlocked the possibility of animals. even if animals themselves would not appear for many millions of years. Imagine standing by an ancient shoreline during this shift. At first, the air is heavy, suffocating, unbreathable. Over millions of years, it grows lighter, clearer. Skies that were once murky with haze become bluer, scattering sunlight in ways we now take for granted. The sunsets soften into the reds and golds we know today. The world becomes brighter, more familiar, even though no animals yet exist to see it. Oxygen is transforming not just the chemistry of life, but the appearance of the planet itself. In the oceans, the changes are equally profound. With oxygen in the water, new minerals form, changing the composition of the seafloor. Microbial communities shift, some retreating into the shadows, others thriving in the new environment. The balance tips slowly, but the direction is clear. Earth is becoming a world that favours oxygen breathers. The foundations of animal life are being laid long before the first true animals take shape. This gift of oxygen is humbling to consider because it was unintentional. The microbes that released it were not trying to change the world. They were simply living, multiplying, following the chemistry that worked best for them. And yet, in their persistence, they transformed the atmosphere, oceans, and future of the planet. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest changes come not from intention, but from the cumulative effect of small actions carried on for ages. Think about the breath you are taking right now. Each inhale fills your lungs with oxygen molecules that trace their lineage back to those early microbes. You are, in a very real sense, still breathing their gift. Every flame that burns, every bird that flies, every human that runs or dreams or sings is part of the legacy of that long-ago shift. Oxygen was not only a chemical change, it was the opening of a door. Beyond it lay animals, forests, and eventually us. Yet it is worth remembering the cost. For the early world, oxygen was a disruption, a catastrophe that wiped out much of what had come before. Progress in the story of life is rarely smooth. It comes with upheaval, with winners and losers, with endings that make space for beginnings. The gift of oxygen was no different. It was both destruction and creation, a dual force that reshaped the planet in ways no one could predict. To picture Earth in this moment is to imagine a world on the cusp of change. The seas still teem with microbes, the land is still barren of plants, the skies are still empty of wings. But in the chemistry of air and water, something profound is happening. Oxygen is gathering, slowly, steadily, until one day the world will never be the same. It is a silent transformation, invisible to the senses of that time, but monumental in its consequences. So when we think of the Earth before animals, let us see it as a place already filled with gifts being prepared. The gift of oxygen was not given with foresight, not wrapped with intention, but it was no less profound. It turned a world of silence into a world ready for voices. It turned oceans of microbes into seas that could one day support creatures of size and motion. It turned a sky heavy with haze into a dome of clear blue, and it continues to this day. Every breath we take a reminder of that ancient transformation. The Earth before animals was patient, and in that patience, it gave us the air we breathe. That air is not just a resource, it is a legacy, a story carried on the wind. The gift of oxygen is the reason animals were possible at all. Without it, there would be no forests, no birds, no humans wondering how it all began. It was the most precious gift Earth ever received, given quietly by tiny architects who never knew the future they were making. 15. Precursors of animals. There is a moment in Earth's story that feels like the soft turning of a page, the shift between one chapter and the next. After billions of years ruled by microbes, after the oceans had been transformed by oxygen, something new began to appear. These were not yet animals in the sense we know them. No fins darting through the water, no shells glinting in the shallows, no wings or bones. Instead, they were strange, soft-bodied beings, drifting quietly in the seas. They are known to us now through faint impressions left in ancient rocks, ghostly outlines of forms that hint at creatures but also defy clear understanding. They are called the Ediacaran biota, and they were the precursors of animals, the first attempt at something beyond the microbial world. Imagine descending into one of those ancient oceans. The water is still, the seafloor covered in microbial mats that stretch like carpets across the sediment. No fish stir the currents, no crabs scuttle, no starfish cling to rocks. And yet, among the mats, there are shapes. Some resemble discs pressed into the mud, others look like fronds swaying gently in the water, their leaf-like bodies anchored to the ground. Some are simple ovals, quilted with ridges, lying motionless as though waiting for something unseen. They are not plants, though they look like leaves. They are not animals in the modern sense, though they are larger and more complex than microbes. They are something in between, an early experiment in form and size. These precursors of animals were unlike anything alive today. Some may have absorbed nutrients directly through their surfaces, soaking up sustenance from the water around them. Others may have grazed slowly across microbial mats, leaving faint trails behind them. They had no skeletons, no shells, no eyes or mouths that we can clearly identify, and yet they were alive, multicellular beings that hinted at the diversity to come. Their very existence shows us that life was beginning to explore new possibilities, to test the idea of bodies larger than a single cell, to reach beyond the microscopic into the visible world. For millions of years, these strange organisms populated the seas. They lived in communities, sometimes clustered together like meadows of soft fronds, sometimes spread across wide plains of microbial mats. To us, they might seem eerie, silent fields of leaf-like forms swaying in currents without predators to disturb them. It was a world without conflict as we understand it. No hunting, no fleeing, no drama of survival played out in motion. Life then was passive, content to endure, to exist, to quietly fill space. And yet, within this calm, the seeds of animals were being sown. The Ediacaran forms are mysterious because they leave us with more questions than answers. Were they truly ancestors of animals, or were they a separate experiment that left no descendants? Some researchers think they were early versions of creatures that would later diversify in the Cambrian explosion, primitive relatives of sponges, jellyfish, or worms. Others argue they were an evolutionary dead end, an entire world of life that thrived for a while and then vanished. The truth may be a mixture of both. Some lineages may have survived and evolved, while others disappeared, leaving only their shadows in stone. Imagine walking along a seafloor among them. The light filters down from above, scattering softly through the water. Around you, the ground is patterned with strange impressions, discs, ovals, fronds rising like alien plants. They do not move quickly, they do not chase or flee, but they are alive. Their surfaces glisten, their shapes pulse faintly with the flow of water. It feels like a dreamscape, a quiet garden beneath the sea, filled not with the creatures we know, but with precursors, prototypes, whispers of what is to come. What is most striking about these beings is their simplicity. Compared to later animals, they had none of the features we take for granted. No skeletons to give them strength, no eyes to see, no jaws to bite. And yet, in their simplicity, they carried a profound possibility. They showed that life could be more than small. They proved that cooperation between cells could build something larger, something visible, something new. In them, the concept of animal was beginning to take shape, even if the details were still rough. The Earth was preparing too. Oxygen levels were rising, creating an atmosphere that could sustain larger, more active creatures. Nutrients were cycling more effectively, carried by rivers into the seas. The stage was being set for an explosion of diversity, though it had not yet come. These precursors were the prologue, the opening lines of a story that would soon rush forward with dramatic speed. They remind us that evolution is not always a smooth path, but a series of experiments, some leading onward, others fading into silence. There is a quiet beauty in imagining this age, a world where life is visible but still slow, where the seafloor is dotted with soft forms rather than bustling with motion. A time before predators and prey, before shells and spines, when the seas were calm gardens rather than arenas of survival. It is difficult for us, accustomed to a world full of conflict and noise, to picture such stillness. Yet for millions of years, this was Earth's reality. A gentle world of precursors, drifting in silence, unhurried, unchallenged. And then, as time moved forward, change gathered pace. The Ediacaran forms began to vanish, perhaps unable to compete with the rising complexity of the Cambrian explosion. Their strange bodies disappeared from the fossil record, leaving behind only the faint impressions we study today. But their role was not meaningless. They showed that life could grow large, that cooperation could create new possibilities, that the door to animals was open. Whether or not they were direct ancestors, they were precursors in spirit, the first visible forms of a story that would soon transform the seas. So when we look at their fossils now, those ghostly imprints pressed into ancient stone, we are seeing more than just shapes. We are seeing the earth practicing, rehearsing, sketching. We are seeing the quiet moment before animals truly arrived, when life was testing its first attempts at complexity. These precursors may not have survived, but they mattered. They were the first shadows of animals in a world that had never known such beings before. They remind us that evolution is not a straight line, but a path of experiments, and every step, even the ones that fade, is part of the story. The precursors of animals were not grand or fierce, but they were bold in their own way. They dared to be large in a world that had only known the small. They dared to take shape, to create form, to exist as bodies instead of just cells. And in doing so, they left us a legacy of possibility, a reminder that every great story begins with a quiet first draft. 16. The long patience of Earth. When we look back at the story of life, it is tempting to focus only on the bursts of change, the sudden rise of animals, the greening of land, the spread of forests, the arrival of humans. These moments shine brightly, and we cling to them because they feel dramatic, immediate, filled with movement. But the deeper truth is that Earth's story has never been one of haste. It has been written in long, patient strokes, in ages that unfolded not in centuries or millennia, but in spans so vast they defy comprehension. Before animals, the Earth was already alive with this patience, a world content to take its time, to prepare slowly, to wait for the conditions that would one day allow complexity to flourish. Imagine watching the planet from far above, not for a day or a year, but for millions of years. Continents drift, mountains rise and crumble, glaciers spread and retreat, seas advance and withdraw. To us, these changes feel impossibly slow, invisible in the span of a human life. But on Earth's scale, they are the steady pulse of time. The Earth does not rush. It breathes in cycles that stretch across eons, carrying life along in its vast rhythm. In those ages before animals, this patience was not emptiness, it was preparation. The microbes that filled the seas understood this rhythm in their own way. They did not live long, their lifespans were fleeting. But they multiplied endlessly, each generation carrying forward the slow work of transformation. They released oxygen, drop by drop, until the atmosphere was changed. They spread across rocks, forming mats that broke stone into soil. They endured through ice ages and heat, through volcanic fire and flooding seas, always persisting, always continuing. Their patience was not stillness but persistence, an unbroken line of survival stretched across billions of years. The Earth itself seemed to mirror this persistence. Consider the slow drift of tectonic plates. The continents of that time were not the familiar shapes we know now, but smaller fragments, colliding and merging, splitting and drifting. Over eons, they rearranged themselves, forming supercontinents, only to tear apart again. Each collision raised mountains, each separation opened new seas. These shifts provided fresh environments, new coastlines, new habitats for microbes, and later for larger life. Yet they happened so slowly that to stand in one place would reveal nothing. The patience of stone matched the patience of life. The oceans, too, carried this long rhythm. Currents shifted over ages, circulating heat and nutrients in patterns that took millennia to stabilize. In their depths, volcanic vents spewed minerals, creating pockets of life that persisted through extremes. The seas were laboratories of slow experimentation, testing and retesting the possibilities of life. The patience of water matched the patience of stone and cell, a harmony of elements that together shaped the world. What is most striking about this long patience is how it carried within it the seeds of sudden change. The oxygen released by microbes accumulated slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day it tipped the balance and reshaped the atmosphere. The glaciers of Snowball Earth advanced and held the planet in ice for millions of years, only to retreat suddenly when volcanic gases warmed the air again. The Ediacaran organisms appeared after ages of microbial rule, a visible bloom that had been prepared for by billions of years of invisible groundwork. Patience does not mean nothing is happening. It means that change is gathering quietly, waiting for its moment. If we stood on the shore of that ancient world, it might feel timeless. The tides rise and fall, the waves crash, the wind sighs across barren rock. Nothing seems to move forward. Yet if we could see through the veil of time, if we could compress millions of years into moments, we would see a world constantly in motion. Microbial mats spread and retreat, continents drift, climates shift. The patience of Earth is not stillness, but movement at a scale so vast it looks still to us. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson of the pre-animal Earth, that patience is not empty. It is creative, it is fertile, it is essential. The world we know today, with its forests and creatures and skies alive with birds, was not built overnight. It was built by ages of waiting, by the quiet persistence of processes too slow for us to feel. The long patience of Earth is what allowed life to endure through catastrophes, to adapt to new conditions, to try again and again until complexity finally flourished. Think of your own breath, your own heartbeat. Each feels immediate, fast, constant, yet both are made possible by oxygen, by soil, by nutrients that were prepared long before you existed. You are breathing the result of billions of years of patience. You are alive because Earth did not rush, because it allowed the slow unfolding of conditions that would eventually permit animals, and eventually humans, to appear. It is humbling to realize how brief we are in comparison. Our lives measure decades, our civilizations centuries. Even the longest human histories span only thousands of years. Against the backdrop of Earth's patience, we are flickers, sparks in the dark. And yet, we are part of that same patience. We carry its legacy in our cells, in the oxygen we breathe, in the very atoms of our bodies forged in stars and recycled through stone and sea. The world before animals was a world of patience, of cycles unfolding at their own pace, unhurried, unforced. It reminds us that not all progress is quick, not all beauty comes in bursts. Some of the most profound transformations require ages of quiet persistence. The Earth has always known this. It has always been patient, and in that patience, it has created wonders. So let us not see those pre-animal ages as empty, as pauses in the story. Let us see them for what they were. Chapters of deep preparation, times when the world was laying foundations, gathering strength, readying itself for the leaps to come. The long patience of Earth is not behind us. It continues even now, shaping futures we cannot yet see. We are part of it, carried along in its slow rhythm, as life always has been. 17. The Cambrian Dawn. There are moments in Earth's story when the pace quickens, when the long patience of ages gives way to sudden bursts of change. For billions of years, life had been small, quiet, and slow, dominated by microbes, shaped by oxygen, and tested in endless experiments of form. But then, around 541 million years ago, something extraordinary began. It is called the Cambrian explosion, though the word explosion is misleading. It was not a single moment, not a sudden spark, but a dawn, a gradual brightening of diversity, a sunrise of animals spreading into the seas. For the first time, the world became crowded with visible life, with movement, with drama. It was the Cambrian dawn, the beginning of animals as we know them. Imagine descending into the oceans of that time. The seafloor, once quiet and coated with microbial mats, is now alive with activity. Strange, soft-bodied creatures drift through the currents, some resembling jellyfish, others more like ribbons or worms. In the sediments, small burrows appear where animals have begun to tunnel, churning the mud, stirring nutrients that had lain undisturbed for eons. Above them, spiny forms scuttle along the ground, their hard shells glinting in the filtered light. For the first time, predators and prey exist, chasing and fleeing in a new kind of interaction. The ocean, once a calm garden, has become an arena of survival. One of the most striking features of the Cambrian dawn was the invention of skeletons. Animals began to grow hard, part spines, plates, shells that offered protection and structure. Trilobites, with their segmented bodies and armoured exoskeletons, crawled across the seafloor in vast numbers. They were among the first creatures whose fossils still dazzle us today, intricate patterns pressed into stone, shells left behind traces that would last for hundreds of millions of years. creating a record of this new burst of life. For the first time, the story of animals was written not just in whispers but in bones and shells that endured. This new age was not only about defense. The rise of predators drove an evolutionary arms race, pushing creatures to move faster, to burrow deeper, to grow spines or develop new senses. Vision may have become sharper during this time, with some animals developing eyes to better detect movement. The seas, once still and silent, were now alive with pursuit. Life had entered a new dimension of interaction, no longer content to simply exist, but now locked in the dynamic dance of predator and prey. The Cambrian dawn was also about diversity. Entire body plans appeared, some familiar, some strange. Worms, sponges, mollusks, arthropods, and chordates began to establish themselves, creating the blueprints for nearly all the major groups of animals alive today. Some forms were bizarre and left no descendants, like Opabinia with its 5 eyes and long grasping proboscis, or Hallucigenia, a tiny worm bristling with spines that seemed to walk upside down. Others were the ancestors of familiar lineages, the first primitive versions of creatures that would one day become fish, insects, and even vertebrates like us. The Cambrian dawn was both a laboratory of oddities and a foundation of futures. To imagine this world is to feel both wonder and disorientation. The seas were crowded now, filled with creatures unlike anything that had come before. The silence of microbial ages had given way to motion, to swarms of trilobites, to drifting comb jellies, to soft-bodied fronds waving as animals grazed upon them. The seafloor was etched with tracks and burrows, the water filled with suspended life. To our eyes, it would seem alien, yet strangely familiar, the first oceans where life moved in ways that echo the living seas of today. What caused this dawn? Scientists still debate the triggers. Perhaps it was the accumulation of oxygen, finally reaching levels that could support active mobile creatures. Perhaps it was the build-up of nutrients after Snowball Earth, feeding bursts of growth. Perhaps it was the invention of vision, setting off a cascade of adaptation as creatures began to see and chase one another. Perhaps it was simply the culmination of countless experiments, the moment when the groundwork of billions of years finally tipped into visible abundance. Likely, it was all of these together, converging to ignite the dawn. What is certain is that the Cambrian dawn changed everything. For the first time, ecosystems became layered with complexity. Producers, grazers, predators, scavengers all took their place in the web of life. The oceans became dynamic, filled with interactions that rippled outward. The balance of survival shifted daily, shaped not only by the environment but by the choices and movements of other creatures. It was a new kind of world, one where life was no longer passive but active, no longer quiet but loud in its diversity. The fossils of this age give us glimpses into that alien ocean. In places like the Burgess Shale in Canada, exquisitely preserved remains reveal soft-bodied creatures with delicate features still intact. Looking at them, one feels the awe of peering into a time when animals were new, when life was experimenting boldly with forms that seem strange to us now. Some of those experiments lasted, forming the roots of familiar lineages. Others vanished, leaving behind only their shadows in stone. Together, they paint a picture of a world waking up, a dawn of movement and form. It is easy for us to think of the Cambrian as a beginning, but it was also a continuation. Everything that appeared then had been made possible by what came before: the oxygen exhaled by microbes, the lessons of Snowball Earth, the patience of the long microbial age. Without those foundations, the Cambrian dawn could not have happened. It was not a sudden miracle, but the flowering of seeds planted over billions of years. In this sense, the Cambrian explosion was not an explosion at all, but a sunrise, slow at first, then brilliant, lighting the world with new life. So when we picture the Cambrian dawn, let us imagine not just its strangeness, but its wonder. A world that had once been silent was now filled with motion. The first predators hunted, the first shells clinked against stone, the first ecosystems tangled together. It was the beginning of animals, the moment when Earth became not just a planet of microbes, but a planet of creatures, each with its own form, its own strategy, its own story. It was the dawn of diversity, the dawn of drama, the dawn of us, the first ecosystems. When animals finally appeared, they did not exist in isolation. They lived together, side by side, in seas that had once been ruled only by microbes. This togetherness created something new, something greater than the sum of its parts: ecosystems. For the first time, life was not only about individual survival, but about relationships: who fed on whom, who competed, who built the foundations others depended on. The first ecosystems were fragile, simple by our standards, but they were also profound. They marked the moment when the Earth shifted from being a stage of solitary experiments to a theatre of interactions. Imagine diving into one of those Cambrian seas. The water is alive with shapes. Trilobites crawl across the seafloor in clusters, their many legs moving in coordinated rhythm. Above them, jellyfish-like creatures drift with the currents, translucent and delicate, pulsing gently as sunlight filters down. In the mud below, worms burrow, leaving winding tunnels that churn the sediments, stirring nutrients upward into the water. Strange, spiny animals scuttle along, feeding on soft-bodied neighbours. Some creatures graze on microbial mats that still cling to rocks and sediments, scraping away at the slimy films that once ruled the world alone. For the first time, life is not scattered, it is woven together. At the heart of these first ecosystems was energy, flowing in new and intricate ways. Microbes still provided the base, capturing sunlight or feeding on chemical reactions. Small animals fed on them, filtering the water or grazing on mats. Larger animals fed on those smaller ones, creating chains of energy transfer that had never existed before. Predation, the act of one animal consuming another, added a new intensity to survival. It was no longer enough to exist. Now creatures had to avoid becoming food while still finding their own. The web of life had begun, fragile and unsteady, but unmistakable. What made these early ecosystems remarkable was how quickly complexity blossomed. Within only a few tens of millions of years, a blink in Earth's history, entire food webs had formed. Producers, grazers, predators, and scavengers each took their place. This interdependence created resilience but also vulnerability. When one group thrived, others responded. When one collapsed, it sent ripples outward. Life had become a network, not just individual lineages, and that network carried with it both opportunity and risk. The seafloor in those times must have looked strange to our eyes. Instead of coral reefs, which would come much later, there were fields of microbial mats dotted with soft-bodied animals and armoured trilobites. Instead of schools of fish, there were swarms of arthropods moving in unison, their hard shells glinting in the dim light. Instead of crabs or lobsters, there were peculiar creatures like Anomalocaris, with its great segmented body and grasping appendages, hunting through the water with eyes that were among the most advanced of their age. It was a world alien to us, yet familiar in its structure. Predator and prey, grazer and scavenger, each playing a part in the whole. What is striking about these early ecosystems is how they reshaped the environment itself. Burrowing animals stirred the sediments, mixing layers that had once been stable. Grazers changed the distribution of microbial mats, thinning them in some places while allowing them to flourish in others. Predators forced prey to evolve defenses, spurring the rise of shells and spines. In turn, the presence of shells changed the chemistry of the seas, locking away minerals in new forms. Ecosystems were not just communities living within the environment, they were agents shaping it. Life had begun to transform not only itself but the planet around it. To imagine standing on the shore of such a world is to feel the shift in atmosphere. The ocean before animals was silent, a place of stillness where change unfolded slowly. But in this new age, the seas were restless. Each tide carried the motions of countless creatures. Each current carried the drift of life. Though no voices yet called out, no birds yet circled, the water was alive with movement, with relationships, with a web of interactions that pulsed invisibly through the currents. The Earth had entered a new mode of being, no longer patient preparation alone, but active interplay. Yet these ecosystems were also fragile. Because they were so new, a shift in climate or chemistry could unravel them. Extinctions occurred often, wiping away lineages that had seemed strong, replacing them with others that adapted better. Entire groups of Cambrian creatures vanished without leaving descendants, their places in the web quickly filled by new arrivals. The ecosystems were dynamic, constantly reshaping, learning, and improvising. They remind us that survival is never guaranteed, even in times of abundance. And still, from their fragility came strength. Each collapse opened space for something new. Each extinction paved the way for innovation. The ecosystems of the Cambrian were not final forms, but beginnings, prototypes of the intricate webs we see today in forests, reefs, and grasslands. They were the first drafts of an idea that life has rewritten endlessly, that survival is not a solitary act, but a shared network of dependence and exchange. Consider for a moment the simplicity of it all. A worm burrows in the mud, stirring nutrients that feed microbes. Those microbes grow, feeding filter-feeding animals. Those animals, in turn, are prey for larger predators. Each act is small, but together they form a pattern larger than any single creature. This is what an ecosystem is: the whole greater than the parts, a living web that no individual controls yet all participate in. In this sense, the first ecosystems were not just biological events but philosophical ones, reminders that life is not only about the self but about the connections between selves. The Cambrian ecosystems are long gone now. Their trilobites are fossils, their strange forms preserved in stone, but their echoes live on in every web of life today. The forests where birds sing, the coral reefs where fish dart, the grasslands where herds migrate, all of them are descendants of that first weaving together. The patterns established in the Cambrian have never faded. They have only grown more intricate, more layered, more diverse. So when we think of the first ecosystems, let us picture them not as primitive but as pioneering. They were the first attempt at a grand idea, the idea that life could not only exist but coexist, that survival could be shared across networks of interaction. In their strangeness and fragility, they carried the blueprint of everything to come. They remind us that the earth before animals was not truly silent. It was simply waiting for the moment when life would learn how to weave itself into a web. 19. Before the forests. When we look at the earth today, it is difficult to imagine it without forests. Vast canopies stretch across continents, roots dig deep into soil, and leaves drink sunlight while filling the air with breath. Forests seem timeless, as though they have always been here, as though their green presence is part of what makes Earth Earth. But there was a time, long before animals roamed on land, when no trees rose skyward, no grasses rippled in the wind, no mosses softened stone. The land was bare then, a canvas of rock and dust, sculpted by wind and rain, touched only in places by the thin traces of microbial life. This was the earth before the forests, an austere and quiet world, awaiting the green transformation that would come much later. Imagine standing on such a landscape. The horizon is sharp, unbroken by tree lines. No leaves sway, no branches stretch into the sky. Instead, the ground is rough stone, fractured by tectonic shifts, worn smooth in places by water. Here and there, volcanic plains spread out like dark scars, still cooling from eruptions long past. Rivers carve their way through barren valleys, their banks lined not with reeds or ferns but with naked soil and gravel. When the wind blows, it whistles across open rock, unbroken by the rustle of vegetation. The silence is profound. No birds sing, no insects hum, no canopy casts its shadow. The land is as raw as the bones of the planet itself. And yet, even in this bareness, life was present. Microbial mats spread across damp stone, thin films of green or purple, clinging stubbornly to surfaces where moisture lingered. Cyanobacteria, the quiet architects of oxygen, colonized shallow pools and river edges, painting them with subtle hues. Lichens' partnerships of fungi and photosynthetic microbes may have begun to creep across exposed rock, softening it grain by grain. These were not forests, not even plants as we know them, but they were beginnings. They were the first attempts to claim the land, to transform stone into soil, to prepare the ground for future roots. From afar, the land may have looked lifeless, but up close, it was alive with small struggles. Each microbial mat exhaled oxygen, enriching the air one breath at a time. Each patch of lichen worked to break down minerals, slowly creating the earliest hints of fertile ground. Over millions of years, these small acts accumulated, setting the stage for the greening of continents. The earth before forest was not empty. It was a place of quiet preparation, where life's patience was building the possibility of trees. The skies above such a land would have felt vast, overwhelming. Without the vertical presence of forests, the eye would travel unbroken from horizon to horizon. Storms would sweep across plains without resistance, winds scouring the ground, rains cutting new channels into bare rock. The scent of soil would be absent, for true soil had not yet formed. Instead, the air would carry the sharp tang of minerals, the faint breath of volcanic gases, the dryness of dust. To us, it might feel stark, even alien, but it was Earth, simply in an earlier chapter of its story. The rivers and lakes of that time were different as well. Without plants to anchor the soil, sediments washed freely into the water, clouding it with minerals. The banks eroded quickly, reshaped by every storm. Nutrients flowed into the seas, feeding microbial life that flourished there. The land could not yet hold itself steady. It was loose, shifting, restless. Only when roots arrived would the ground learn to stay, to resist the pull of wind and water. But for now, it was a land always in motion, unanchored, unbound. It is humbling to think how recent forests are in the deep history of Earth. For over 3 billion years, life thrived without them. Only in the last 400 million years did true forests appear, rising suddenly in geological terms, transforming not only the land but the atmosphere itself. Before that, the continents were silent, their surfaces shaped only by stone and storm. Animals would one day crawl onto this land, but when they did, they would find it bare. The first forests would not greet them for many millions of years more. And yet, this bareness was not wasted. In its openness, it gave space for experiments. Microbes tested the boundary between water and land. Early fungi began to form partnerships that would one day allow plants to thrive. The land without forests was a laboratory of beginnings, an austere canvas on which life was sketching its first strokes. Without those sketches, the masterpiece of forests could never have been painted. If you could stand in such a world at sunset, you would see the rocks glowing red, unshaded by trees, the light falling directly on stone and water. The silence would be immense, broken only by the rush of rivers or the crack of stone shifting in heat. The stars at night would blaze brighter than we know them now, unsoftened by haze from vegetation, their light pouring down on a land still raw. It would feel empty at first, but then you would notice the glisten of microbial films on wet stone, the faint green shimmer of life in shallow pools. Small, yes, but persistent. The beginnings of forests were already there, invisible seeds carried forward in the patience of time. When the forests finally came, they transformed everything. They anchored soil, pulled carbon from the air, built canopies that shaded rivers and softened winds. They filled the land with sound of leaves rustling, insects buzzing, birds singing. They made the earth familiar to us, but before them, the world was different, harsher, quieter, more open. It was not worse, only earlier. The earth before forests was a land in waiting, a stage being set for one of the greatest transformations life would ever achieve. So let us not think of those bare landscapes as empty. Let us see them as profound in their own right, as places where stone met sky, where microbes laid the first foundation of soil, where the future of forests was being patiently prepared. The earth has never been still, never been barren for long. Even in its silence, even before its greening, it was alive with possibility. The world before forests was a reminder that transformation begins quietly, with small steps, with the persistence of life working grain by grain, breath by breath. 20. A world waiting for animals. There is a feeling one gets when standing in a room just before an orchestra begins. The instruments are silent, the audience hushed, and yet the air feels charged, as if something is about to happen. The earth, before animals truly filled its seas and its skies, carried a similar weight. It was a world of preparation, of patience, of long rehearsals. The microbes had done their work, oxygen had filled the air, the land had been shaped by storms and volcanoes, and the first experiments in multicellular life had begun. It was a world not empty, not barren, but waiting. Waiting for animals, waiting for movement, waiting for the symphony of life to rise into sound. Imagine walking along the shoreline of this ancient earth. The rocks stretch bare into the distance, tides lapping steadily at their edges. Pools glisten in the sun, thin films of microbial mats painting them green and purple. In the shallows, soft-bodied organisms drift lazily, anchored like fronds or lying quilted against the sand. There are no footsteps on the beach, no wings in the sky, no fish darting below the surface. And yet, the world feels pregnant with possibility. The air carries more oxygen now, clearer than before, ready to sustain more complex breathers. The seas are rich with nutrients, stirred by burrowing worms and grazing creatures. Everything is in place for the next chapter. The Earth at this time was like a stage set carefully piece by piece. The lighting had been arranged by the slow rise of oxygen, the backdrop painted by continents drifting and colliding, the floor prepared by microbial mats that spread across rock and sand. The players, the animals, were beginning to emerge, but their roles had not yet been written in full. It was a moment of anticipation, a pause before the curtain lifted on the drama of diversity. Life, for billions of years small and patient, was readying itself for a leap. This sense of waiting was not artificial. It was built into the very rhythms of the Earth. Oxygen had accumulated to levels that could fuel larger, more active creatures. Nutrients cycled through seas in ways that supported food webs more complex than ever before. The experiments of multicellular life had shown that cooperation among cells could build bodies, that form and function could stretch beyond the microscopic. Each step was complete in itself, yet each pointed towards something greater. It was as if the Earth itself was leaning forward, ready for animals to arrive. The world must have seemed both alien and familiar. The skies were blue now, clearer than in ages past, the same scattering of light that makes our skies blue today. The oceans stretched vast and deep, their waves and tides pulled by a moon that was slowly drifting farther away. Sunlight fell on continents bare of forests, their stone surfaces shining raw in the heat of day. In many ways, it was still the same Earth we stand on, the same air we breathe, the same seas that lap our shores. And yet, it was quiet. Too quiet. The familiar sounds of life, chirps, songs, rustles, splashes were missing. What remained was the patient hush of a world preparing. And then, as time moved forward, the waiting began to end. The Cambrian dawn brought animals in abundance, trilobites scuttling, predators hunting, burrowers reshaping the seafloor. Ecosystems blossomed, intricate webs of energy linking producers and consumers. Life grew bold, diverse, loud in its own way. But before that dawn, in the stillness of the Ediacaran and the long patience of microbial ages, the Earth was quiet. It was a world waiting, not yet filled with motion, but already holding the breath of what would come. To imagine standing in that moment is to feel the weight of time itself. We are accustomed to seeing change quickly, seasons passing, generations succeeding one another. But here, change stretched across millions of years, each step slow, deliberate, patient. The Earth did not rush. It prepared carefully, ensuring that when animals did arrive, they would not flicker out like sparks in the dark, but blaze into an era of abundance. The waiting was not wasted. It was essential. This long preparation also reminds us of something humbling. Animals, for all their later dominance, were not inevitable. They arrived only after the Earth had been transformed by oxygen, by microbial persistence, by countless quiet experiments. Without those foundations, animals could never have existed. We are not the beginning of the story, nor even its center. We are latecomers, children of a world that waited patiently before we were possible. And so, the Earth before animals was not merely a prelude. It was its own long, beautiful chapter, filled with alien colors, microbial architects, frozen ages, volcanic lifelines, and patient preparation. It was a world that looked quiet to our eyes but was alive with work, alive with the shaping of possibility. It was a world waiting not in emptiness, but in fullness, gathering all the elements that would allow the next leap to unfold. When we breathe in now, when we look at forests or watch animals moving across land and sea, we are witnessing the result of that waiting. Every leaf, every wing, every heartbeat is made possible by the patience of a world that spent billions of years preparing. The silence before animals was not absence, it was anticipation. It was the hush before the music, the stillness before the dance, the moment before the Earth exhaled and filled its seas with motion. The Earth was waiting, and then, at last, animals arrived. But the waiting itself was beautiful, necessary, and profound. It reminds us that creation often comes slowly, that the greatest symphonies begin in silence, and that even a world without animals was already alive with promise. The story of Earth before animals is not just the story of what was missing, it is the story of how patience built the conditions for life as we know it.